Let's hear some remarks from our steering committee, who I'll introduce in the order in which they'll speak. First of all, Eva Müller, who is Director of the Forest Policy and Resource Division of FAO. Peter Holmgren, who is the Director General, the outgoing, I should say, Director General of CIFOR. Stephen Johnson, who's the Assistant Director for Trade and Industry of the International Tropical Timber Organization. Garo Batmanian, who's the lead environmental specialist from the World Bank. Gijs Breukink, who is Coordinator of Responsible Forestry at WWF. Naomi Perez, who's the President and CEO of the Finance Alliance for Sustainable Trade. And Bernard de Galambert, who is the Innovation and Bioeconomy Director at the Confederation of European Paper Industries, and also on the advisory committee of the Sustainable Forest-Based Industries. With that, again, welcome all. Let's have a wonderful discussion and look forward to some remarks from our steering committee. Thank you, Eva. Please.
I was so enchanted by hearing that we have children here that I didn't hear that you asked me to start speaking, so very sorry.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here on behalf of FAO. Let me say that we are proud to host this meeting here in FAO, which is actually a joint effort by a number of partners that are with me here on the podium. And I would like to start by thanking our partners for making this event happen, for your commitment, enthusiasm, and hard work. Secondly, I'm delighted to see such a diverse and large group of participants here. We have more than 100 participants registered from more than 40 different countries of all continents. We have government representatives, NGOs, community organizations, forest producers, the processing and manufacturing industry, business associations, financial sector consultants, certification bodies, researchers, development agencies, and the UN. So indeed, a very diverse group of participants. And all of you are here because we share the same interest in enhancing the recognition of and promoting the important role sustainable wood value chains can play in sustainable development. And this is very important and timely. Over the past decades, there has been a strong tendency in the global policy debate to consider forests mainly as a resource that is threatened by destruction and needs to be protected. While this is certainly true, it ignores the productive potential of forests and the positive contributions their products can make to social and economic development. And at a time where the global community has made an important commitment to pursuing a sustainable development path, which includes tackling climate change, this productive potential of forests should no longer be ignored. Historically, wood products have been the forest products that have the highest value, and they continue to deliver a lot of benefits to a lot of people. The problem is that unsustainable harvesting has led to forest degradation in many countries, and this has sort of given wood a bad reputation. And even though we have seen some significant progress in the past years, for example, on reduced impact logging or on legality of timber trade, the markets have been quite slow to recognize these sustainable practices. So the result is that sustainable value chains compete with unsustainable ones, and that puts them at a disadvantage. We, the organizers of this event, have realized that strong advocacy is needed to unlock this potential of sustainable wood value chains to contribute to a sustainable world. And the meeting aims to do just that, but it also aims to do more. We firmly believe that the meeting should be a first step of a process that would see the establishment of a platform for advocacy and promotion of sustainable wood value chains. So this meeting, Sustainable Wood for a Sustainable World, has been conceived as a startup of an initiative to raise awareness of the availability of sustainable wood products and their wide uses and benefits. With this event and with future actions that we will be taking as an outcome of the event, we want to reverse the perception of wood as a driver of environmental damage and of social disruption by showing how, when, and where wood is delivering contributions to the 2030 agenda. To achieve this objective, the meeting is designed to produce a set of key messages on the benefits of sustainable wood products and the challenges of expanding sustainable wood value chains that can be fed then into policy processes, including, for example, for the UNFCCC. So I would call on all of us to focus in the next couple of days our energies on producing some really powerful messages that will convince policymakers and the private sector alike. And before closing, I would also like to draw your attention to the small exhibition we have in the area where you had your welcome coffee earlier. This exhibition provides some good examples of best practices for sustainable wood value chains from different parts of the world. It shows enterprises that have gone one step further to more diversified and more sustainable value chains that provide benefits, especially for smallholders and local communities. And we hope that these examples can serve as an inspiration for others. So I would encourage you all to take a closer look at the exhibition, including taking also the flyers that provide more information on each of the cases. So with this, I wish you fruitful discussions and a very successful conference. Thank you.
Peter, please, yeah.
Thank you, James, and thanks, Eva, for that introduction. It's great to be back here at FAO. Excellencies, colleagues, friends of old, on precisely this day, 500 years ago, the 31st of October, 1517, a scholar called Martin Luther nailed 95 theses on the door of the All Saints Church in the city of Wittenberg. We know this as the start of the Reformation, and it was, of course, a major challenge to the powers that be, particularly in this city. In fact, thesis number 86 said, "Why does the Pope build the Basilica of St. Peter's with the money of poor believers rather than with his own money?" Let's know that this was 500 years ago. I don't think it's controversial to make this quotation today, but who knows. Now, what is the relevance of all this to our conference today? Well, first, Martin Luther nailed sheets of paper onto a wooden door. Let's take this point to say that wood products appear in many, many aspects of our lives and often makes progress possible. Secondly, and this comes back to Eva's point before, Luther pointed to the discrepancy between the priorities of the rich and the needs of the poor. In the rich global north, our recent politics on forests have become fixated on achieving our climate and conservation goals, forgetting that wood products was, and still is, and particularly for poor people around the world, a very important provision for livelihoods in many different ways. So forests have indeed been put in the environment corner, and to that, as I've said before, nobody puts forest in a corner. I commend FAO for taking this initiative to put wood products back on the table, and I assume it's a wooden table. Then thirdly, what Luther started was not a short-term initiative. It was not a set of secular determination goals to be achieved by 1530. There was no Agenda 1530. These changes took hundreds of years. So also our ambitions should be long-term and not locked into short-term thinking, especially as we're talking about forests. That said, the SDGs, as we call them today, they provide us with the currently most promising, or maybe only, avenue for making political as well as real progress. and it's critical that we link to this framework. And then finally, Luther's doing was about political courage, standing up against questionable paradigms of his time. And this conference is, of course, much more mundane in its scope, but I have some nails up here if we get to that. And then I'd also like to mention that these 2 days are actually my last days as Director General of CIFOR. It's a good way for me, I think, to finish my tenure with many colleagues present, and also here in Rome, where Ann-Sofi and I lived for many years and where our children grew up. So I look forward very much to the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Stephen.
Thanks, James. And first of all, welcome to this meeting to everybody from ITTO. We're very proud to be one of the co-organizers, and we thank FAO especially for taking the lead on putting this meeting together at what was fairly short notice. I think everybody involved can agree. But they did a heck of a job. This message that we're trying to convey, sustainable wood for a sustainable world, is 100% consistent with ITTO's mandate to promote sustainable tropical forestry and a sustainable trade in tropical forest products. Unfortunately, too often, we in forestry and forest sector have lost the argument that wood is good, despite all of the life cycle assessments and environmental product declarations that clearly show it's a superior product in almost every way to competing materials when we take into account the environmental costs of production and use. We need to change this narrative by showing that sustainably produced wood and forest products in general are the best solution to slowing deforestation and all of the ills associated with it. ITTO hopes that this conference is a step in changing this narrative, and we look forward to working with FAO and all of our other partners here at the main table to establish sustainable wood value chains in the tropics and elsewhere. I think these 2 days will be a good starting point, as Eva said. We have many ideas of how we would like to continue this dialogue, and it's extremely important that it continues after the meeting. So I hope that everybody here is ready to help us out in that regard as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Garo.
Me, right? Okay. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you, Eva. This is a great opportunity. I think I'm glad that FAO is doing this. I also want to thank Thais and her team. I saw how much hard work was into organizing this successful event. So thank you, FAO, and thank you, Thais. And I want to say hi to all my old friends that some of them already come and talk to me. Yes, I lost some hair, but I'm still the same person. And I'm glad I'm working with you again, guys. Regarding why the World Bank is one of the co-organizers of this, that doesn't seem to be very simple, is that the World Bank has a mission of ending poverty and improving the prosperity of the 40% bottom of the 40% of the lowest, the poorest in the country, with sustainability. So why we're working on forests? Well, let me give you some numbers. Up to 1/5 of the global population, 1.3 billion people, derives direct and indirect benefits from forests in the form of employment, forest products, and contributions to livelihood and incomes. Rural households living near forests obtain about 22% of their income from timber and non-timber sources. An estimated 9% of rural population, 11% in Africa, are lifted above extreme poverty line with income from forest resources. The formal timber sector contributes to $600 billion for the global economy, about 1% of the global GDP. And it's estimated that more than 50 million people derive jobs from timber activities. So forest is part of investment. Forest is part, I'm just echoing what Eva just said, that forest is part of investment. Forest is part of development. Is a type of land use. And if we can only achieve this kind of success and work with these people, we tend to be the most poor if we improve the sustainability of the value chains. For many years, most of us have worked on improving the quality of the forest management, and we have achieved that, and we should continue working on improving the quality of sustainable forest management. But at the end of the day, if the timber produced sustainably is not generating enough revenue, people are not going to be better off, and eventually we'll move away, and the land use will no longer be forest. The land use will be another one, that without forest. So that's what we need to do. But one of the things that we also have to pursue is that timber represents many things. You know, Peter just mentioned paper and wood for doors, but the wood for doors are not the same wood for chips, and it's not the same wood for plywood. So when we're talking value chains, I hope that we can also start segregating what is it for, what are the value chains, because they are different value chains, they are different products. We cannot consider interchangeably that we can replace mahogany with plywood somewhere. Mahogany goes for veneer, cheap wood goes for wood chips, and so forth. And those are different products. From the economic point of view, they are different products which we have different value chains, and we have to start looking into that too. And I hope that today and tomorrow we start this discussion. And so it's not value chains in timber, it's value chains of timber products. And depending on the type of product, you have a completely different value chain, and we have to look into that as well. So I see this as the first step, a very important step, and I'm glad that we're part of it, and I'm looking for a successful workshop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Garo. Noemi.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Noemi. It was quite my fault. Hej, please.
All right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be representing WWF here in this forum. I'd like to compliment particularly Thijs on being able to pull all of this together. It's a great pleasure to speak with all of you on this very important topic. With regards to WWF's viewpoint on the matter, needless to say, forests are essential to life on Earth, from providing oxygen to habitat to wood. But the full value is currently not recognized by global or local markets, policymakers or consumers, nor are they effectively safeguarded in public policies and governance systems. On the other hand, more food, fuel and fiber production is needed to meet our society's needs and to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. As a result, forests are often replaced by other land uses that generate higher short-term economic values, or they are gradually depleted through unsustainable harvesting, hunting, poaching, and uncontrolled fire. Forests are also increasingly falling prey to unsustainable road and infrastructural developments. These challenges are often compounded by climate change and unsustainable use of forests by poor or displaced communities struggling to overcome poverty and secure land rights. Conserving forests requires land use planning and natural resource management practices that take into account the risk to businesses, governments, and society if forest ecosystems decline, as well as equitable and inclusive economic development policies that empower forest-dependent people to pursue sustainable livelihoods. Some of the opportunities that we see in many countries, there's a rising awareness about sustainability issues and climate change combined with a groundswell of international and voluntary public commitments. This has opened up new windows of opportunity to influence key public policies affecting forests. Inclusion of forests in the Paris Climate Agreement as an example is a clear recognition that forests have an important role to play in turning the tide on climate change. The next several years will see more and more countries refining their intended nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, which includes actions to halt and reverse the rate of deforestation and forest degradation. An even larger number of countries and private entities will be reporting their progress towards achieving SDG 15 concerning forest conservation, and numerous multi-sector platforms, alliances, and dialogues, such as we're having the next 2 days, are being set up to support governments of all levels, companies and communities to develop policies, actions and legislative frameworks. In addition to having the opportunity to influence policy decisions, we are seeing growing willingness and capacity of key stakeholders to implement these decisions, leading to sustained behavioral change. Programs such as jurisdictional approaches, commodity-based moratoria, timber legality, tenure reform, and RED Plus are gradually taking hold, while growing corporate engagement and public campaigns in consumer countries are redefining business as usual in forest product sourcing. There are rich lessons to be learned from these experiences that could be shared with and should be shared with emerging markets. New technologies such as global satellite systems, real-time forest monitoring, fire trackers, timber tracking apps, etc., provide new opportunities to tackle threats to forests in an innovative way. And furthermore, new finance mechanisms for sustainable landscapes, including payments for ecosystem services, are beginning to become operational at scale. The role of our organization, we see us having a unique strength in our extensive global network, which allows us to combine local knowledge and expertise with global perspective and reach. We have long-term relationship with both private and public sectors, as well as the civil society, and are positioned to act as facilitator for change, enhanced through the ability to be a respected partner in negotiations at all levels. This allows us to build bridges through a local to global approach that combines our underground expertise with a global outlook and influence. Our solutions and cooperations-oriented approach, our global brand, as well as the professional ability to reach out to partners, alliances, and platforms in the appropriate way, allows us to open doors and makes us a great catalyst for change. We are moving forward with a new transformational strategy that will allow us to focus more on using our strength to influence high-stake decisions in land use and natural resource management policies and incentivize behavioral change from forest communities to multilateral companies to end users. And with that, I thank you.
Thanks very much, Hej. Naomi.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, FAO, for hosting this event, and again, particularly to Thais and her team. I have a question to the audience. How many people know FAST? If you raise your hand. Okay, thank you. As you see, we are not new in this space. FAST works with financial institutions and other stakeholders around the world. We actually collaborate with the FAO through the forest and farm facilities led by Jeff. I'm actually chairperson of the steering committee. We also collaborate with FSC, with CIFOR, and our mission is to facilitate access to finance for sustainable production and trade, particularly in agriculture and forestry and other green sectors. As we all know, access to finance is a major bottleneck for accelerating development and financing for sustainable forestry, and of course, the wood value chain products are no exception. This event is a good step to consider what is already happening on the ground and what are the financial products and services already existing, and of course the document of forest trends that will certainly contribute to analyze what is already done and where do we need to go. But this event is an excellent opportunity to identify clear strategies to move forward into the right direction. Particularly for the financial sector, key risk management issues in forestry involve major challenges in the value chain, such as land tenure or land use and legality. And those are issues that can only be solved with clear policies, willingness, and participation of all the actors, public and private, as us here today. On the other hand, technology and digitalization are providing practical solutions to solve some problems of our time. Google and other companies are expanding access to internet in the world, especially in Africa. We have heard about the success and expansion of M-Pesa to facilitate access to finance in Africa. M-Pesa allows users to deposit, withdraw, transfer money, and pay for goods and services easily with a mobile device. The good news is that according to a survey that FAST carried out among financial service providers, investment in sustainable wood is considered, is actually something that financial service providers are willing to look at in terms of financial opportunities, under certain conditions, of course. So this event is an opportunity to answer some questions and increase the flow of finance into the wood value chain. Some of the key questions are, how can we make investments in the sustainable wood value chain easier for financial service providers? How can sustainable wood capture the attention of different investors? And how can different investors maximize their impact with their resources, combining credits, equity, blended finance, public funds, etc., to make a sustainable impact? How can technology and digitalization support access to finance? This event is an opportunity to get the conversation started and identify ways to move things forward. So I convey to you our desire to participate in this effort, and of course, I would really like to see in the coming days and hear your ideas to ensure that we can accomplish our goals. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Noemi. Bernard.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. I guess I have a bit the same challenge as Noemi, which is who in the room knows about the ACSFI, which is on top of that an unpronounceable acronym or something like that. So I'm representing here the Advisory Committee for Sustainable Forest Industries, which had several names before and does exist as a statutory body in FAO for several decades, I think, because we had our 58th meeting last year in Berlin. It's there to provide guidance to FAO on topics which are relevant for forest-based industries all over the world. And the membership of the ACSFI consists of forest owners representatives, forest industries representatives in the wood, paper, and beyond chain. So it's quite vast in terms of membership. And I must say that together with the FAO, and thanks to the excellent support we receive from FAO as well, we've managed opening up and discussing very relevant topics for the industries, such as the role of forest plantations, such as the important need to have a constructive dialogue on forest certification, but also the contribution of forest industries to climate change mitigation, the use of water, the use of wood for energy, etc., etc. So there are plenty of very positive files that have been discussed, and I think we have contributed modestly to make things change in the right direction from an industry perspective. I guess no one will be surprised if, as an industry representative, I and we in the ACSFI welcome this conference that is touching on the use of wood, because it's our core raw material and it's our, I would say, bread and butter in the life of our industries. But now this use of wood by industries has always been generating, I would say, mixed, not to say conflicting feelings. And I've heard several questions going in different directions, and I quote some of them. Are we as industries using wood contributing to deforestation? That's the kind of question we face. Are we as industries destroying landscapes, ruining biodiversity? Are we as industries doing worse for climate by using wood than if we would leave forest intact? Are we having negative impacts on people, on soils, on water, on air, etc.? These are the kind of negative answers we face, but we also questions we face, but we also face positive asks and considerations. Isn't a wooden interior warmer and more cozy? How can we leave oil? What can replace oil and fossil materials? Can our future only depend on plastics, concrete, steel, glass? What are the alternatives to coal, gas, nuclear power when it comes to energy generation? And I think these are all the answers we may, or the questions we may wish to discuss today and over these 2 days, and we hopefully will open all these debates. let's remember that the conversation started 25 years ago at the Rio summit, when we started putting there the sustainability word on the radar screens and discuss sustainable forest management. And the conversation has been ongoing. And we believe in the industry that we have taken some major steps forward in the direction of a more sustainable way of managing forest and using wood. I'll quote some of the data concerning the industry sustainability performance. We have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 16% over 10 years. 2/3 of the energy we use in industry is coming from biomass, is renewable. More than half of the wood we buy is coming from sustainable forest management certified by some of the credible certification schemes operating worldwide. We are champions in recycling. That's to be known. We are very good at recycling with nearly 60% recycling rate. We have reduced significantly the use of water in the industry, but also we take care of people by reducing, for example, the number of accidents and fatalities at work, because it's as important as environmental sustainability is about people and the people who work in the industry. On top of that, we do represent an innovative industry. For us, we believe, and I was introduced as Innovation and Bioeconomy Director, we believe in innovation and in the bioeconomy. We believe that wood is able to replace a number of current fossil, based on depleting resources products, such as plastics, such as other fibers, but also in my dreams, I wish there would be an iPad 15 only bio-based with lignin-based carbon fiber, printed electronics, and nanocellulose-based touchscreen. And I think overall, everything I did mention is in the labs. It's just a matter of combining all that into the end product, the bio-based product. Now, don't take me wrong. We've done a lot, but there's still a long way to go. So we've done a lot in terms of sustainability, but the UN SDGs are there to remind us what's the ultimate goal, where we need to go. I hope the conference will help us moving forward and without any complacency. I think that's important, and identify where this industry and the use of wood has been and will in the future be contributing to a better world, which means a better world not only from an environmental perspective, but also economically and socially better. So let's make sure that in this conference we don't paint it all black, neither we paint it all rosy. The truth is definitely in between, but let's leave our ideologies and prejudices outside of the conference room and really talk freely about how sustainable use of wood can contribute to a better world. So on behalf of the ACSFI, and the chairman of ACSFI, Masataka Hayama, is in the room, I would like to wish you an excellent conference and thank again FAO for having organized it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bernard. Thank you all, the members of our steering committee, for those excellent remarks. Peter, I was naturally struck by your shamelessly journalistic use of Martin Luther in the beginning of the Reformation. Indeed, it was a centuries-long process that he began, but it was also deeply disruptive. And I hope that what we will also hear in the next couple of days are disruptive ideas for how we go about shaking up this agenda, refocusing the debate on the sustainable use of wood, communicating that to policymakers, to investors, and ultimately widening the application of wood in our economies. Thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen, and let's move on to our second event of the day. Are you hearing me? Apologies. Thijs is going to paint a bit more of a picture to help us understand what we mean by these value chains that need implanting into the international development agenda. I think the word that she's given me in my notes is to restore the role of sustainable wood value chains. I wonder if implant or create that role might be more accurate. And after Thijs has done that for us, we'll hear, I think, some more contextualizing remarks, perhaps focused more specifically on finance and the role of finance in bringing to life those value chains, realizing and growing them, from Michael Jenkins of Forest Trends. So with that, Thijs, please.
Thank you, James, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm very happy to have all of you here discussing sustainable wood production, sustainable wood value chains. That is more than wood production. It goes well beyond. It goes from the forest to the ultimate use of wood products. And restoring, I think, the role of wood production, not only sustainable forest management, it's sustainable forest management and its generation of jobs, its generation of income, and its generation of products that can contribute to a low-carbon future. And we need to understand how these value chains realize their values, how we add value in each stage, where we add value, who get benefits from that. And this is what we want to discuss here today. We really want to restore the role of wood value chains in the forest agenda. Forests are a number of things. And among all these things, there is also wood production, and we cannot neglect that. And I'm very happy to see all of you engaged here to have this discussion on how we can make forest production sustainable, how we can make forest production generate income, how we can make forest production to generate jobs, and eventually how can we make forest production improving livelihoods of those that are in the forest and improving the life of the planet. With that, I would like to start my presentation. Jorge, could you please put the first slide, please? Thank you. Yes, thank you. So, towards sustainable forest value chains. Next, please. The first thing to understand the context of this event is think of the SDGs. The SDGs is our overall framework for everything we do. It's our overall framework to think of what are our goals, what are our objectives, and thinking of development, of sustainable development. And all the countries in the planet, they agreed to a certain number of goals, to 17 goals, with very clear targets, very specific targets. And if we look at these SDGs, we can see the presence of wood or the potential contribution of wood products in many of them. We can look at SDG 1, poverty alleviation. We have generation of employment and economic growth through wood value chains. We can look at SDG 2. Who would think that wood value chains could contribute to alleviate hunger? But it can. It can because wood fuel contributes to food security and enhance the safety nets of a number of forest communities. We can think of SDG 7 on energy, and yes, wood fuel is the most accessible energy in many rural and urban areas, and wood energy can be used for insulation, it can be used for energy efficiency purpose. We can also look at SDG 8 and think of decent work and economic growth. And yes, the wood value chains, not only they generate jobs. If we are to manage our forests sustainably and if we are to produce wood products that are consistent with the challenge of a low carbon future and intense in technology, we are also generating jobs that demand skilled labors. So it's good quality jobs. If we look at SDG 9, on industry, innovation, and infrastructure, this is exactly what Bernard was just telling us about how we can advance, how technology advance in wood value chains, how we can make a much more sustainable consumption and production by using technology, by advancing technology in wood value chains. We can think of SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. Again, and we can look at climate change. And climate change actually gives us the great opportunity of making all these other contributions happen. Because climate change has made the world more aware of the importance of a more sustainable planet. Climate change has made all of us think on what are the options to make this planet more sustainable. If we look at the reports that came out this weekend, we are peaking again on the CO2 concentration levels in the atmosphere. So everyone in this planet now knows that something needs to be done. And it's critical that we can think of the technologies, that we can think of the products that can store carbon, that can reduce carbon emissions. And wood value chains are absolutely one vehicle for that. But more than that, and it's my big square, we need to think that wood production is critical for life on land. It's critical for forests. It cannot deny the role of sustainable production to keep forests healthy. It is beneficial for biodiversity. It's not controversial. It's not antagonistic to biodiversity. It's important for increasing generation of provision of ecosystem services. And more than that, a forest that is productive has value for the people. And a forest that has value for the people will be kept as forests. If the forest cannot deliver benefits anymore for people, people will destroy them. So promoting sustainable wood value chains, it's a way of valuing forests. And this is what we want to reintroduce, the discussion we want to introduce in the international dialogue. Next, please. You will have noticed that we are not speaking about wood products. We are not speaking about sustainable forest management. The key expression in this meeting is a different one, is sustainable wood value chains. And Garo made a very good point in his introduction because he said there are several value chains that are based on wood products. And this is what we need to understand. We need to understand what makes a value chain sustainable. We need to understand what are these different value chains, what are the actors involved in these different value chains, what are the requirements needed by these different value chains. So a sustainable wood value chain, what is it? It's one of the forest value chains, because the forest has also the non-wood forest products value chains. The forests also produce ecosystem services. So part of our job here is to understand that we need good governance, and we need to make sure that good governance is in place for managing forests for the different values and to ensure social, economic, and environmental benefits from sustainable wood value chains. So reconcile these different forest functions, and we all know that those are the basics of sustainable forest management, but thinking of how forest provides its different products. we also need to understand a little bit better how national, international markets drive the value chain sustainability and how the product differentiation plays its role. If we keep looking into forests as a homogeneous thing, if we keep looking at wood as a homogeneous thing, if we keep looking at wood products as a homogeneous thing, we cannot advance. So it's very important that we can understand what are the differences, what are the species, what are the purpose, what are the processing lines, what are the key issues for advancing sustainable value chains. The other thing we would like to highlight is what is a value chain? The value chain comes from the very beginning, so from the moment that a tree is harvested, is the initial step of the value chain, but it goes all the way through processing, manufacturing, retailing, consumption. And within the value chain, we have all the services, finance, advisory. So there is a number of activities that come together to make a value chain work. So all those segments need to be aligned towards sustainability. So it's not only the sustainable forest management, it's not only the harvesting of a tree at the forest site that needs to be sustainable, but the employment relations that are established, the other environmental impacts, the social responsibility, all needs to be in place. The efficiency in the use of the resource, all needs to be in place to make a value chain sustainable. Next, please. So when we look at the value chain, when we take a value chain perspective, more than a product perspective or a forest perspective, we are looking at the very different stakeholders that are engaged in a value chain. So we have government, we have private sector, we have local communities, we have global society, and there are different roles, the different roles they play. So one thing that is interesting when we look at the forest value chain is that because of its nature as a natural resource, a renewable natural resource, governments that are usually the regulators for forests, many times they are the forest owner. So they play different roles, they play multiple roles in the forest value chain. When we look at the private sector has all these traditional roles as it has in other value chains, but we need also to consider the local communities. We need also to consider the communities that live on the forest and that also have rights on the forest. And they play their role, and we need to make sure that their rights are respected. And we need to think that the products that come out of a forest, they are relevant not only for those that are living on the forest, but they are relevant also for the global community because forests are perceived as a collective, a global asset. It's a property of all of us. So whatever a global society thinks about a forest product, it impacts the local production of a forest product. Next, please. And eventually, we have a wide range of wood products that serves as final products, but also serve as inputs for a number of industries. Next, please. So what are the constraints to expanding production and use of sustainable wood? We have seen recently the substitution of wood products for other products such as concrete, plastic, and metals due to price, technology, scale, and safety standards. We have also observed that the forest products, they are not usually seen as part of value chains. The value chain approach is very common for agriculture, for instance, but for forestry, it looks like a novelty. And one of the reasons for that is that the actors, the linkage between these actors is still a little bit fragmented. So it's still difficult to understand how these different segments, how the different actors, they connect. And these eventually jeopardize access to finance and development of more efficient channels of commercialization. We also have a problem of weak governance. And where you have weak governance, you also do not have enabling conditions for investments. Then the investment environment is poor, especially in developing countries. And we have a very poor dissemination of information on cost structures and markets that prevents the proper modeling of the sustainable wood products business case. So when trying to attract private investment to forestry, especially in developing countries, one of the obstacles is that the finance sector cannot really understand how this business is done, where are the risks to the business, not to say the bad reputation that increase the risk. Next, please. So we are here today to discuss sustainable wood for a sustainable world, and our objectives are very clear. They were all very well stated in our opening session: to raise awareness of the availability of sustainable wood products and their wise yields and benefits, to unblock markets and finance for sustainable wood, to dispel a perception of wood production as a driver of environmental damage and inequity, and to show how, when, and where wood contributes to the 2030 agenda. As Bernard rightly said, it's not all black, it's not all rose either, and we need to come up with what can make these value streams stronger and really unlock their potential to contribute to the SDGs. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Thais. I mean, I guess when you list the constraints on sustainable wood value chains, substitution from other materials, weak governance, disorganized value chains, and a failure to disseminate knowledge and awareness, connect to markets thereby, that sounds like everything, actually. The constraints are pretty much everything. Michael, can you kind of in any way cheer us up, or at least tell us why we should be more depressed?
I'm going to cheer you up. And first, thank you for inviting me to be here and participate in this process. We've been working a little bit over the last several weeks to put together a paper that can kind of capture this momentum and this initiative. It's great to see many old friends here in the eternal city of Rome. Great place to be. And I think I'd also like to say how this meeting was put together very quickly, and I want to congratulate the organizers, but I think it's a reflection of the sense of the urgency and the opportunity that we see in this space. So I like the pace. I think we have to keep moving quickly. What I wanted to do was, again, continue the contextualizing of this issue, but remind us of the scope and the scale and the path that we have been on. So Garo mentioned a couple of things, that over 1 billion people are forest dependent in one way or another, that we have that forest products, the forest industry represents roughly 1%, and let us be reminded that 20% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is covered by forests or woodlands. Now, what's interesting when you think about those is there's a disconnect. You've got this very big piece of resource, forests and woodlands. You've got a huge population, a quarter, a fifth of the world's population that are in and around this resource, and yet it represents 1% of GDP. So for me, there's the first alarm bell that says, and that when we did this research 20 years ago, it was 3%. So that number is going down, it's not going up, because we're not valuing forests correctly. We're not valuing all of the assets that forests present correctly when we think about the kind of financial values globally. Just to think a little bit again, remind us a little bit about the path we've been on. So 4 decades ago in the 70s, and some of us were working in this field in the 70s, there was really nothing around. Sustainable forestry was just an early concept. I mean, the real standard forestry in that time was large-scale natural forest exploitation. And that had been the history for hundreds and hundreds of years. So sustainable forestry as a concept is really 4 decades young. You remember that in those early days, many of us will remember that sustainability was really about sustainable yield, not sustainable forest management. So even, in our lifetimes, we've seen this pretty dramatic change. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, we could only document that 1% of the world's tropical forests were managed in a sustainable way. And today, we're having this conversation again because we've actually been able to bring a lot of attention to this issue of forests as a natural resource base. It's become kind of the center of a much larger public debate and lots of regulatory scrutiny, frankly. But it hasn't really gotten us to where we want to go, and I think that's really the theme of this conference. And so I wanted to think a little bit again of this pathway, and it's been mentioned a couple times, but it's really been 20, 25 years that we've seen a whole range of actors, companies, civil society groups, communities. I was thinking that Alfonso Argüelles is here, who I've worked with for many years from Mexico. Governments and investors have started to lead this idea of sustainable forestry and really create almost like a sector, a new sector, and that's really an important thing to think about, an important concept that is in some spaces, I would say, mainstream, certainly as a concept, whether it's a reality, but we're starting to see that shift where this idea of moving from traditional forest practices to more sustainable forest practices is going to become mainstream. Ideas like low-impact forestry methods, of course, the community engagement and leadership on these, independent certification, FSC is here, buyers groups, affirmative government procurement policies, think the UK, think of different, the Lacey Act in the United States even, investment in red over the last decade, post-Copenhagen, the Norways, the UKs, the Germanys that have been putting billions of dollars into this sector. And then, of course, in the last few years, you've had this movement where you have companies that are talking about zero deforestation in their supply chains. So all of these are threads of the same wave, if you would, the same movement. And then I need to mention that when we started Forest Trends 18 years ago, our idea was that we needed to start to think about the full array of products and services that forests provide, that we needed to move away from forests being seen only as fiber and into this much broader spectrum of goods and services, including forest products, that are going to really give it the value that it needs. So again, just to kind of remind us, this is a very, we're talking about how do you build out sustainable forest product supply chains, and we are 30 years into this movement of sustainable forestry. So not surprising that we're in the place we're in right now, but delighted am I that we are thinking urgently about moving from just rolling around this idea of sustainable forestry to make it an actuality. And the way you do that, the way you implement, is you have supply chains that bring real value to the forest landowners, whether they're small communities, whether they're companies, whether they're governments, that are going to allow us to keep forests on the landscape and forest products in our lives. So I'm going to move quickly through the beginning of a presentation so we can have time to talk later. But next slide, please. So next slide, please. That was basically. So when we think about some of the considerations and the findings and kind of doing this analysis of where we are, when we think about sustainable wood products, there is a different environment that we're in right now than there was 30 years ago. And part of that different environment that we've mentioned are, one, you have the new SDGs, the 17 SDGs that are in the circle out there. We've had the Millennium Development Goals. Before then, they didn't really, I think, deliver very much. I think there's much greater hope that the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be a much more powerful message through society. And as others have mentioned, when you think about sustainable forestry and the services and the products that forests provide, in terms of employment, economic opportunities, in terms of food security, in terms of water. Half of those sustainable development goals match up with what we are trying to talk about today and move forward. In addition to that, you have the outcome of Paris and the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. 35 of the countries that signed the Paris Agreement, forests are central to their strategy to reduce emissions. So we now have another engine, which is the NDCs, that we can be driving some of this work within. A third piece to think about is that there has been, in the last 6-8 years, something like that, there's been a movement to think about what some people would say are landscapes, what other people would say are jurisdictions, but it's taking kind of global ideas and bringing them down to a scale where you can actually operate and implement on them. And again, forestry is going to be a very big player in many of these places, in Indonesia and Brazil, and Bolivia, and Colombia and Peru. Many, many countries are now starting to explore this idea of jurisdictional approaches. And of course, all of this is, you need to, for jurisdictions to function, you need to have a partner to the regulatory side of that equation, which is really the production side. We need to demonstrate to these governors that there is a real benefit and a real profit to be made by managing forests in a sustainable way, and their landscapes and agriculture. There's all the research we always hear is that there's going to be an increased demand for forest products going forward. A population of 10 billion people, whatever we get to, I think a lot of people are imagining that demand would quadruple by 2050, for instance. And the implication is that we have a crisis again. There's going to be more and more demand on forests. We need to make sure we can conserve the forests we have. We need to make sure we can build value into those forests and deliver products and services coming out of that forest that are going to feed that appetite that's absolutely going to grow. So it's an opportunity in my mind. The image that we have up there, just to give you a quick sense of our history, is we did a initiative at the MacArthur Foundation about 25 years ago, where we looked at this idea of sustainable forestry and how do you think about it through that lens of supply chains. And I think that's a very powerful way to implement a concept like sustainable forestry. So it has been a short path so far for us, but for some of us, we're impatient to keep moving to the next steps. Next slide, please. Some of the barriers and constraints that have been mentioned already. There is, in many parts of the world, there is a bias against wood. It's a perception that it's a building material for poor people. They'd rather have masonry and concrete products. We're seeing a shift of that in some of the European countries, a little bit in the United States also. But there is a perception that we need to fight, which is, again, wood is a preferred and a superior product and should be embraced widely. It's going to be, I'm glad that, Eva, you mentioned that it's really an advocacy campaign, because I think that's what it is. I think we've got the technologies, we've got some finance, but it's a matter of packaging all those together, and it's going to take policies, and it's going to take incentives. It's going to take political will. It's going to take some technical assistance to figure out how do you substitute and change these things. And it's going to be willingness of consumers to demand these kinds of products. There are a parallel part of this, and what we've been working on quite a bit of recent is thinking about sort of financing around sustainable forestry. And actually what we're calling it is natural infrastructure, not only forestry, but other natural infrastructure solutions. And there's real challenges, which are the historic challenges of forests. There's poor governance in many parts of the world. There's poor ability for enforcement of policies. There are ineffective revenue systems, low levels of capacity processing that are in many parts of the world we care about. There's not enough policy and institutional support, and there's low organizational capacity at the same time. A parallel piece of that, and what comes along with that, is the sort of the dark side, I think, that's been mentioned, which is forests have been painted with a brush where it's all illegal. It's all about negative things that are happening in forests. We're deforesting, we're losing biodiversity. All of this is kind of the negative kind of narrative that's being built, and I think for us, the challenge is going to be turning that narrative into a positive narrative and talking about the role that forests can play moving forward in addressing many of these challenges that have been laid out by the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but because we have people in the audience that are really expert in this. But there are technologies that have been emerging very rapidly that give us some real interesting opportunities to think about forests and forest products in a different way. There's a process going on that many of you will know, ICAO, which is the aviation community is talking about how do they address their emissions reductions needs. And forests are very prevalent in that conversation. And there are technologies right now, so forest offsets can be a piece of that. But in addition to that, there are technologies that are allowing us to think about wood-based products, biofuels, and how those can be a part of the aviation airline transport industry going forward. Bioenergy and wood pellets, there's been some conversation about that already. What's exciting is to think about if we move away from coal-fired power plants, there are many wood-based products that can substitute for coal, so we can retrofit those industries and run them in a much more sustainable way where we have greater opportunities. Then engineered products coming out of forestry, wood cross-laminated timber, a relatively new product in the industry. We're now starting to see that applied in lots and lots of different settings, where we talk about a new term called plyscape, which is you can start to build skyscrapers, buildings with some of these materials. There's some exciting developments in the United States and in Europe where you're seeing these buildings starting to replace what had historically been concrete and cement. And of course, with that, it's much less energy intensive than concrete. It's got much better environmental performance. So all of these are technologies that are starting to prove themselves out. I was impressed in the exhibit out there. There's the applications of cellulose and lignin. So there's now underwear that's made out of wood-based products. So we see the opportunities where wood can really come in and replace plastics, replace cement, replace steel, all of these things that I think we're realizing as a society cost the planet too much. So we are in a nice place to be able to think about that substitution. Final slide, please. So I wanted to scan out. So we started talking about forest broadly and sustainable forestry. We've narrowed in. What we're talking about today is really wood-based sustainable products. But I wanted to scan out a little bit because I think the old saying that there is no silver bullet really is true. And I think when we think about forests and we think about the future of forests and the value of forests, there is no one silver bullet. We need to think about the full spectrum of services and products that forests provide if we are going to value them appropriately and if we're going to have them going forward. And I think of three takeaway messages maybe, or when we think about digging deeper into what the next steps are going to be for this group. The first is, we haven't talked at all about carbon, and that's really the elephant in the room. And when we started Forest Trends, 18 years ago, the view was we were going to have carbon markets. And as you start to have carbon markets, you're going to have real prices that are going to drive this systemic change into the system that we have in terms of emissions. And forests, of course, are going to play a huge role. 30%, 37%, some of the recent reports that have come out. But we don't have a carbon market. We have a little bit of a carbon market. We don't really have a carbon signal set. But we do have, carbon is clearly an asset. So when you think about wood products going into the marketplace, sustainable wood products and sustainable supply chains, let's embed them with these idea of these other assets. So they provide these incredible additional services. That's what's going to differentiate these products in the marketplace, is that they are low intensity in terms of emissions. They are community friendly in the most cases. They are providing incredible water services. All of these things are, so think about the message of assets embedded in this product that we're delivering into the market. The other is, I'm glad that there are a couple of people here that we're going to be hearing from that are architects, because I think we need to find the right messengers of our message to be able to get to the public and to society. And I've worked over the years with Bill McDonough, who is a really unusual thinker and an architect that has been in the space for some time. But the architects are a great messenger of this message into the public. And also, engineers are very important messengers of it. These are the folks that take these products and make them real and bring them into our lives. So to think about engaging with unusual suspects is another really important issue. Finance. We am happy to talk much more about finance a little bit later. But I think behind all of these things is finance. If we can get finance flowing into these ideas, they can get to scale very quickly. There's a new term that's being tossed around that's probably old wine in new bottles. They call it blended finance. And basically, this is public-private finance. How can you make those things work? But again, I think the opportunities, the moment is riper now than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago to think about this idea of bringing public sector finance that has all of these interests and these values, protecting forests, providing economic opportunities for smallholders. All of those things are in the interests of public institutions like what Gatto is doing at the World Bank, GEF, other places. And alongside that, you have an emerging set of investors in this space that are keen to think about other places to put money. I'm cautious about using this term impact investors, because I think most people are now sort of feeling like there's a lot of fluff behind that term in terms of folks that are impact investors. But what is clearly happening is that you have more and more institutional investors looking to put their money to work. There's something like $70 trillion that are out there that are looking for investments. And so I think we have a wonderful opportunity when we think about natural infrastructure solutions, we think about sustainable forest products, to be able to bring some of that investment into our world, which of course will drive us to a much larger scale. We had a meeting just last week in San Francisco with around blended finance, and we had about 150 investors in the room with us talking about these natural infrastructure opportunities to invest in forest projects, opportunity to invest in water projects and habitat restoration projects. And they're very unusual types. There was a guy who runs the New Mexico Pension Fund is there, and he says, first thing he said when he was presented, he says, I'm not an environmentalist, but I'm here because I want to make money. So I think the opportunity, the doors are opening where we're going to have many more types of investors looking at the kinds of products that we're developing so that these supply chains can actually get ramped up and supported. And I'll leave it right there for comments.
That's great, Michael. Thanks very much indeed. I, for one, need to get myself some sustainable wood underpants. I don't know if...
They're right out there.
Are they really? I recommend them to everybody in the audience too. Sustainable wood underwear. Christmas is coming, ladies and gentlemen.
Tell us how they feel.
Yeah, I will.
If it feels like you're wearing wood.
With alacrity. We have about 10 minutes for some questions from all of you to kind of warm you up a little bit. We also have some microphones circulating. So can I invite you all, please, if you have a question, to raise your hands, introduce yourself very briefly, and then ask a short-ish, pointed question to Michael and Thijs. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen. Gentlemen here. And just so I can see where else there is interest. No more interest.
Thank you, Marco Boscolo from FAO. Beautiful presentations, thank you very much. I had a question for Michael. You mentioned that substitution with other products is a challenge to promote sustainable wood value chains. And at the same time, you said that between 2012 and 2050, demand for wood products is expected to quadruple, almost outpace supply. So I wonder how you reconcile these two pieces of information. Do we need better products? Do we need this, instead of quadruple, to quintuple, or even, what is the message there? Thank you.
Yeah, I think and I think about this when I ride my bike to work, and the bike path gets more and more crowded. I go, that's a great thing. But the truth is that the roads are getting more crowded too. So it's just we're going to have more and more of everything. So even as we see an expanded demand for wood products, we potentially could see a very expanded demand for the alternatives, you know, the concrete and the steel. So I think the challenge is to kind of capture the imagination of the public again, move it away from we don't want to damage forests, to say we really want to lean into forests now and have forests be the products that we rely on more and more. So with that quintupling, and as you say, hopefully it's a much larger increase in that, we'll see the decrease in the other competitive products that are out there. I think it's very possible, very doable. I mean, we've got the science is starting to kind of lay it out very easily, but I think it's a messaging challenge.
Do we have another question or two? Gentleman here at the front.
Dao Zhang from FAO. My question is, why this quadruple this demand coming from? How do you estimate in the next 35 years, 30 years, the demand increase 3 times?
It's mostly when you look across, I mean, I think there's been a lot of work on this, but if you look at a population that grows to 10 billion people and a population that's getting wealthier, that's demanding more and more different kinds of wood products. So you can think about, you know, what we've seen quickly is even in a place like China, demand for many more types of wood products. You think about flooring that is, you know, hardwood flooring and things like that. All of those are the sectors that you can see this growth in.
Naomi has a question. Where? Who? A gentleman here first, and then Naomi. If we have another microphone. Naomi, please, and then to this
Thank you
gentleman.
for the interesting presentations. Michael, one of the challenges that we have seen is precisely, as you said, there are trillions of dollars out there. That's why we actually exist, to facilitate that flow. But particularly with pension funds, they have a lot of money. Like for them, 100 million is a small investment. So any ideas of how can we actually bring that money to the ground, like to the small and medium enterprises?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, well, we should definitely get to know each other a little better, because that's part of what we're working on right now. And I think what we've been trying to do in the last year or so is work with some of these investors to understand, to really map out who they are and what their needs are. I think there's a lot of talk around public-private partnerships and public-private investment. We don't have a really clear map of exactly who those investors are and what their demands and needs are. But as soon as we have that kind of a map, you can start to think about the the different ways of packaging and aggregating. For us, it's for the kinds of things you believe in, probably in us. It's taking. How can you take small producers that are small scale, that are in very remote areas, and how can you package them in a way so you can get investors like pension funds interested in that? And I think aggregation is going to be the part of the trick.
Thanks. Gentleman here.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mrs. Thais. I've got one question. You said that for the government, for the sustainable wood, the government play a role, each role, as the forest owner, as a regulator, and also financing. My question is, what can happen if you look your experience here? What can happen if the government, in same time, they create and they manage one company, a private company, in same time? And they got a role to forest owner, as you said, to make a regulation and so on, and financing. But in the same time, they create the private company inside the government. What can happen?
Yes, thank you. This is a very interesting question, especially because I don't think it's restricted to forests. We have a number of ways on how government manages its economy. And sometimes one of these ways is to establishing companies, not private companies, because once they are owned by the government, they are not private anymore. They are state-owned companies that might even abide to a private law, but it's still a state-owned investment or enterprise. And the reason why I put that in the value chain graph is not because we want to discuss what are these different ways whereby governments manage economy, but it's more that for forestry, we have a very particular situation where, because of its characteristic of a renewable natural resource, you have in many countries, and actually the recommendation for good governance is even something that considers that, is that the government is the owner of the resource. Does not necessarily mean that the government is the one that is going to manage the resource, to make direct management of the resource or produce from the resource, but it means that the government is not only the regulator, but it's also an actor that is the owner. So the property rights related to the resource and how communities can relate to the resource, or how private companies can relate to the resource, it passed by this complex governance structure where the government is actually also the holder of property rights. And it also plays the role of finance, of production, and other things. So it makes the assessment of forest value chains, I don't like to say that it's more complex, because we have these, it's a terrible habit, I think, to say that forests are too complex and they're too different of everything else. And eventually we exclude ourselves, we exclude forests from their normal business model, and makes it more difficult to finance. But it's important to highlight this aspect, because it's different from agriculture, where it's mostly done in private lands. It's mostly done based on private property. And for forests, it's not always the case, and this needs to be considered when assessing how this value chain is working. So when assessing the roles that are played by the different stakeholders in the organization of the value chain, we need to consider that there are specific roles that are not present in other industrial or agricultural value chains. That was the intention of the slide. Thank you.
Let's take one more question from this gentleman straight in front of me, and then we'll move on to the next session.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Arthur Reitaker from France, and I used to be responsible of a wood program of French Agency for Energy Management, and I'm also dealing with IPCC. So I agree completely with what has been said, but I am surprised that you put the climate change issue on somehow in a corner, like you said that forest is in a corner. And we know that we are not going to meet the 2 degrees that it's the purpose of the Paris Agreement. And every scientist knows now who is involved in this issue. So that means we have to do everything what we can. And of course, forest and forest products is a major issue in that. But if you put the climate change issue, you will have the different groups going with business as usual. I mean, we are going to do better wood products, laminated and so on. Of course, there's a cost. And the other groups, for instance, in the cement industry, they are also making big progress. And so we are in competition. So if we just have competition, we are not going to make it. I mean, of course, it's fair, it's liberal, but we are not going to meet the goals of climate change. So why don't you exclude this main goal, which could help you? I mean, it's an overarching approach which could help the general focus. Thank you.
Do you want to respond to that, please? I encourage you to. Well, I think if I understood the question, why are you downplaying climate change in this discussion?
Yeah, thank you, James. And I think the reason I asked for James' help is because I think the intention was not to downplay climate change, but to say climate change is not everything. It's not the only benefit provided by wood products. Actually, we just showed how many other benefits are delivered by sustainable wood value chains. And I actually said something that highlights the role of value chain, of climate change, because climate change actually has given us the opportunity to reflect. It's actually quite possible that if it were not the debate on how to make the transition to a low-carbon economy, that we couldn't be here today discussing what are the benefits of sustainable wood value chains, what are the benefits generated, what are the contributions of sustainable wood value chains to sustainable consumption, sustainable production, etc. Actually, the great merit of climate change, with all the problems that they actually are and that we need to tackle, is that it made our society reflect about issues that were not on the table before. So the diversity of stakeholders that we have now discussing forestry and livelihoods and sustainability and recycling and waste, it was not possible 15, 20 years ago. And climate change actually played this role of raising awareness and giving us the opportunity to reflect about the benefits. But it's not only climate, and especially when we speak about forests, it's kind of a paradox, because at the same time that climate change allowed us to focus on forests and to have a much broader audience connected to forest issues, at the same time, it focused only on the negative aspects or the things that were negative happening to forests, such as deforestation and degradation. And we kind of find very little room at the moment to discuss the benefits and the positive sides of forest production, of how forests bring contributions to livelihoods, of the forest-dependent peoples that actually are living on the forest, on food security issues, on wood energy issues, etc. So it's a bit of a paradox. It highlights the topic, but at the same time, it narrowed down a bit, it narrowed the discussion only to carbon, and we need to look beyond carbon. Thanks.
Thanks, Thijs. if I allow myself one very brief comment on this, of course, climate change is a critical part of the overarching context for all discussions of sustainability, all of them. It's not been excluded. And I think, though I used the word downplayed to interpret your question, I don't think this conference is about downplaying it. But just from my own experience talking to policymakers, if you put everything, every question and issue around sustainability in a climate context, their eyes glaze over. And if you have an issue that is also about economic development, but economic development intrinsically based around issues of sustainability, then it's not a bad idea not to stress climate change from the get-go. Michael, could I just ask you one question to follow up on this? Because it touches on an issue that several of our speakers have raised today. The tremendous progress that you referred to at the beginning of your presentation, much of it was around the role of forests in our climate policy discussions. And it's been broadly positive. It's not been nearly as fruitful as I'm sure all of us want, but it's certainly raised the profile in a positive way of forests. It has educated policymakers to a degree. Do you believe that this downside, this danger of looking at forests as in a box to be shut up, a climate repository that can't be touched or developed, is that a direct consequence of this recent progress in terms of figuring forests into the climate discussion, or is it much more long-standing than that?
That's the right question to ask. It's the right question to ask us, all of us that are in the room here, to think about. And, I think the reality of, our realization of the pace of change in climate and the risks that we all face and the potential role that forests play and kind of the solution to that, part of the solution to that, I think has led a little bit to saying, they are a repository. There are the forests over there. Let's keep them because they're going to address climate change. And I think what hasn't happened that we've been all hoping for is that if you can actually put a value on that, then all of a sudden you can start to think about ways that you can build out supply chains that are wood-based and non-wood-based, that are going to be able to provide benefits to the people that are living in and around and managing all of those forests. That's the step that hasn't happened yet. We haven't said, okay, carbon is, $148 a ton, and therefore, if you are playing that role in combating climate by conserving or managing your forests in a sustainable way, and I see those as very similar, then there's going to be some benefit to you. Right now, that does not happen. That does not translate. I think that's the step that we're really missing here. I don't think it's necessary. It's a risk. I don't think we would necessarily be having this conversation if we had not been able to put a price on that carbon, because I think that's how you embed that value into the products. Whether you're whether you're the Awanawa in Acre, Brazil, that are managing their forests in a sustainable way and producing acai for the outside market with this incredible carbon benefit that goes along with that value, or the women that are producing artisan products that are forest-based, they're not timber, but they're forest-based. I think if we had that value right, if we had created that connection, we wouldn't be talking about this today, because I think a lot of these supply chains would be really valuable. We would know what they are, and the values would be there, and more people would be moving into producing these kinds of sustainable products. But the reality that forests play in combating climate has not translated into a real signal, a value signal, a price signal, or whatever you want to describe it, a value signal, to those folks that are actually managing the forests.
Yeah, regrettably. Peter, I think you wanted to ask a question. Is that right? And so can we have a microphone here? And
Garo
Jeff,
had a question over there too.
And Garo had a question, and then we'll close. We'll take 3 questions and then we'll close.
Great, thank you. This is possibly more a comment than a question. 500 years ago, as I said, the top-down symbol was the Basilica of St. Peter's, which you almost can see through the window here. Today, the top-down basilica is the conference center in Bonn, where everything circles about climate change. And this is the conundrum we're in. How ethical is it to frame everything around climate change? I would say that the first thesis we should nail on the door of FAO in these 2 days is to say that climate is a co-benefit of the sustainable landscapes we want.
Sure. Do you mean practical or ethical? You're asking whether it is practical to frame everything around
Nailing it
climate
is
change.
very practical, but it's
It can't be unethical
what has
to
been said
use
on the panel just now is that climate is a great benefit, but it is a co-benefit of all the different good things we want from the landscapes and from the wood value chains. That's a short version of that.
Sure. Well, thank you for the comment. And Jeff here and Garrow also would like do we have one microphone or two?
Thank you. Jeff Campbell with the Forest and Farm Facility, and thank you for addressing the climate. That was my first question, because our partners in the International Family Forestry Alliance, for instance, are primarily concerned that this message get to the UNFCCC and that we, at the global level, it's this whole discussion about climate that they're most worried about in terms of threatening the values of wood and value chains, et cetera. So that's from the producer's point of view. I just wanted to get to the one point that's come up very marginally, and that is that there's this sort of a distinction made between local communities and private sector, and that we talked about different value chains in terms of products, but we didn't talk about combining a value chain with a values chain. That is to say, we have an opportunity to decide how will a sustainable wood economy actually address the SDGs, and that is therefore, how will we be very conscious about the large number of small and medium scale, et cetera, wood value chain actors? And will we simply try to move the whole value chain forward, or will we say, with the responsibilities embedded in the SDGs, we need to focus a significant amount of attention on that portion of the value chain, which has a lot more multiplier effects for the poor, for women, for smallholders, for indigenous people, for communities, and that they are actors in that value chain. They're part of the private sector.
That was more of a comment than a question. I think.
Amen.
Yeah, I think agreement. Garrow would like to ask a question, make a comment, and then we'll move on.
Want to make two comments. On the climate change, I think we have to consider that 114 countries have NDCs related to forest or land use. So that is indeed an opportunity. But forest is a choice of land use. You have a piece of land and you make a choice to keep it as a forest, or you make a choice to cut it down and plant soybean or do something else, right? So it is not possible. So as you said, James, this is the overall issue. But we cannot make these 114 countries achieve their target by two options only, which is let's close down this forest the way it is so there is no emission, and then we plant eucalyptus everywhere else, and then we have all the stocks of CO2 there. That's what we are trying to discuss here, not diminishing the role of climate change. It's just, it is there, and actually is a good entry point because 114 countries have to do that. But it will cost them a ton money they do not have if all we're going to do is protect. Not that protection is not a landscape use type that we should also do. There are places that should be protected, but there are places that you can manage that is not going to cost the country and actually is good for the country and is good for the economy. So it becomes a double win because it's good for the country. You increase your GDP, but you're also contributing to whatever they want to do in the NDC. And you don't come with this false paradox that we now have to fix the problem just because otherwise we just plant eucalyptus everywhere when we do that. That's the first, I think is a message. So it's an entry point, but we don't want this to be the only point. And it cannot be achievable just by protecting because it's too much forest, as Not too much. We have a lot of forests. Forest is never too much. So
From a
we have,
Brazilian.
yeah, we have 20% of forests in the world. We have to protect those, but the way of doing that is also to use. Now, on the value chain issue, I think the climate change actually brings an opportunity. Drywall is made with cement. 50% of the cement emissions cannot be avoided. It's part of a chemical process, which is called industrial process, cannot be avoided. 50% of the emissions from steel cannot be avoided. It has nothing to do with energy consumption. 20% of the world's emission come from industrial processes, which have nothing to do with the energy source. Another 11% comes from the energy sources to the industrial processes. So we can fix the energy source, we cannot fix the 20%. So it's obvious that drywall and steel, things like that, will have to decrease a little bit. And wood could be a substitute for drywalls on plywood, for instance. So we have there is a kind of a tension here that we have to look at the forward-looking of what the market is going to be, what the demand of the market is going to be. Part of it is because of the change that climate change is going to force us to have on a smaller footprint. Part of it is part of the change of value chain has to do with more research and development on timber. 40 years ago, when we start working on this, only mahogany was $1,500 a cubic meter. IP was only $200 or even so, because IP was not considered valuable. 20 years later, IP became this big thing for outdoors, for boardwalks in the Atlantic City, etc. Now the cost of IP and mahogany are similar in the market, almost similar in the market. So we also have to look at as we are talking about timber, especially tropical timber, we have to look at the market, what's going to be the next market view, because we are managing, this is not like tomorrow quinoa is the fashion of the day, so you stop planting corn, you start planting quinoa. You cannot make the switch that quickly. So we have to understand where the market is going, because forest management requires you to protect or to manage the trees that are going to be the next harvest. And we need to know what is that next harvest. And somehow, research and development in forests, I remember Brazil had a very good lab. Those things are just out of fashion. So if we don't do that, no new products are not going to be developed, so we don't have more value chains in the future. That's something I think that we also have to consider when we are talking of managing the forests also for climate change, but everything else for the future.
Thank you very much indeed for those good comments. And will you all please join me in thanking also Thijs and Michael for terrific comments. If I could call on our panelists for our first panel discussion to come up, and if I could also call on whoever has their names to come and see me to make sure we get them in the right order. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our first panel discussion. It's going to follow a familiar format to you. I'm going to ask our 6 panelists to give a 5-minute set of opening remarks. I may throw a question at them afterwards, or we may just move along down the line, and I may ask 1 or 2 of them a question afterwards. We'll keep it within that formal structure, as informal as possible. And although naturally we're already running a little bit behind schedule, and I do want us to stop at 1 o'clock for lunch, we'll try to make sure that there's another opportunity for you all to ask a question or make a brief pointed comment. So please have that in mind during the discussion. Let me briefly introduce to you our panelists, and then with no more ado, they'll get cracking. This conversation is along themes that we have already been discussing. It's about, we're trying to probe a little bit deeper into these sustainable wood value chains, what they are, where they exist, what the problems are in developing them. We have a bit of an emphasis, though not exclusively, a bit of an emphasis in this panel discussion on production and supply to markets, rather than a consumer focus. And to take this forward for us, we have again Gijs Brugink from WWF, going from my left to my right, Pedro Moura Costa from BV Rio, John Huntele from FSC, Javier Noyon from PEFC, Marcus Alves from the Brazilian Forest Service, and Michal Torresov to my extreme right from IKEA. So, Gijs, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Once again, a pleasure to be here. WWF is a dedicated work stream, which we call Forest Sector Transformation, which entails all our work we're doing with predominantly private sector, but also public sector, on forest management and trade in a broad context. We as an organization have a strong desire to demonstrate that the world's growing demand for wood can be met through sustainable forest management, including a new generation of well-managed plantations in forest and with actors from the smallest scales upwards. And this work aims to demonstrate the full value of these forests for wood and the role they play for delivering wider multiple services when integrated into sustainable landscape, services that cannot be readily recreated or matched at scale by other means, and whose presence or absence have profound implications for people, nature, food, water, and climate. So our work on forest transformation will help deliver forest protection, but particularly also better forest management through our ability to affect the viability and value of protected areas with good production forests acting as a buffer, and businesses as a powerful force to support and advocate for better policies and governance in the landscape level planning. But also enabling increased production output and efficiencies, resulting in benefits for biodiversity and national and local economies, and the ability to meet the growing global wood demand without considering additional natural forests being brought into production. And also valuation of forest resources and their attractiveness for positive investment should become more favorable, helping redress the balance of market dynamics which otherwise undervalue forests and the service these deliver, leading to conversion to other land uses. We are working on our forest sector engagement platforms and partnerships to bring those to the next level. We will build on experience from engagement platforms such as the Global Forest and Trade Network, the New Generation Plantation, and also regional pulp and paper alliances that have helped restructure the nature of global forest production and trade. These existing platforms will be evaluated and new opportunities explored to innovate and to scale, improve forest management and trade more rapidly. To give you an example with 2 of the major corporate engagement platforms that we have, the New Generation Plantations platform, which is focusing on new forest, has 15 participants globally, which manage jointly 11 million hectares, of which 95% is currently FSC certified. Whereas another big block of our corporate engagement platform portfolio, if you will, the Global Forest and Trade Network, is working with 160 companies globally, of which 60 are forest managers, and the other 100 are traders, retailers, processors. Companies such as IKEA are also part of that particular platform. And in that platform, the companies that we work with manage jointly roughly 35 million hectares, of which to date around about 27 million hectares are certified. So that work has been taken to a certain scale where we are kind of struggling what the next steps are, because we've, particularly for the Global Forest and Trade Network, and I'll let Luis speak about New Generation Plantation a bit more tomorrow during his speaking slot. But with regards to the Global Forest and Trade Network, we've basically picked all the ripe fruit nowadays, and we're struggling to find growth for that particular pathway. And so we need to think about new ways to achieve this forest sector transformation. So going forward, we basically have 3 avenues to work on a theme: through policy engagement, continue our sector or individual engagement, and also look at change models and extended benefits. And looking at some of the challenges that we have encountered over the years doing this type of work, particularly with regards to Global Forest and Trade Network, again, it's working one-on-one with companies, and you can imagine that it's quite resource intensive if you're working with 160 companies across the globe on a daily basis. Another issue that we are dealing with, and that's changing the game a bit, is changing market metrics. We see many markets shifting more and more towards domestic markets, and those are not yet of a sustainable nature. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on developing sustainable domestic markets. Key stakeholders are also smallholders and communities, and to date, certification is not necessarily working for those, so we need to find ways to bring them into the arena as well and work on sustainability in a better way. Particularly their access to market remains to be one of the major issues to increase sustainability of those actors. And incentives for producing sustainably are also lacking, so we need to put much more emphasis on that in the coming years. And lastly, we need to also create a level playing field, as also noted earlier today already, where illegal material is competing with sustainable material in the same marketplace. Does not help our cause in promoting sustainable wood value chains. And those are my remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Hedge. Can I just press you a little bit, because I think it touches on a question that Jeff asked, or a comment that Jeff made a couple of minutes ago, on the fact that local communities don't seem to be benefiting from certification. When we're talking about bumping up these value chains, of course, the next question, the next consideration is, where does the benefit of that value fall? And if certification, which is kind of the model for this approach, is not delivering those benefits where the trees are growing and where they're being harvested, that's a major problem, isn't it? So do you think that there's enough emphasis on this, and what do we know about what might be required to fix that problem?
The issue there is multiple. So I think first and foremost, what we've seen a lot is access to market, whatever the wood product is that deriving from those forests. Usually, if it's not timber, if we're talking about non-timber forest products or similar issues, the markets are not demanding it. So I think it requires a two-sided approach. You need to work on sensitizing the market to the sustainability of the material that they're sourcing, whatever that market is. And with those corporate platforms, what I was mentioning, such as DFTN, the initial thought was we work on international markets, so we work predominantly in when those platforms started in the Western markets, where the largest pool for material was. However, nowadays it's much more about the domestic market. So we need to have campaigning and advocacy and sensitizing those markets to sustainability or the sustainable nature of the material that's being sourced there, whilst at the same time work at diversifying the produce that particularly smallholders and communities can take to market from their forests.
I'm not sure I understood what solution you're advocating. I mean, regulation? How do you sensitize a market? You implant more rules in it. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think it starts with awareness raising at all levels, not necessarily only at the policy level. Going directly to the end consumer and through them to the policy arena, and then initially you would instill some basic rules with regards to sustainability, but then you need to go even further on the market level. But it's not just working at that level. You need to also work with those forest managers on creating incentives for them, and that can also be in a policy arena where you look at, for instance, payment for ecosystem services, making those more readily available or easier to tap into for those type of forest managers, and that can range from carbon or other ecosystem services. But I do think it's very important to work at both ends of the spectrum at the same time, because otherwise I don't see it necessarily going anywhere.
Okay, so thorny problem, which I think we're going to have more discussion of this afternoon. Pedro Moura Costa.
There we are. Yeah, great. I'd like to touch on a point that the document that Thais sent to us. I mean, the challenges for expanding sustainable wood value chains. And basically, you know, we live in an era of announcements. I mean, we see all sorts of, you know, what was once the domain of politicians. I mean, now we see announcements about everything. I mean, it's the most popular thing about NGOs and CEOs. New York Declaration of Forests, Bonn Challenge, Paris Accord. There was a Cerrado Declaration last week with Prince Charles. They, you know, sometimes they're driven by compliance with regulations, other times by voluntary engagement with new sustainability standards or old sustainability standards, as it were, and so on. In the case of forests, you see, you know, CEOs, you know, making announcements about phasing out illegal timber from their supply chains, or phasing in or increasing the proportion of certified timber into their procurement programs. As soon as they go back home, their technical teams start pulling their hairs, trying to figure out how they can ensure that they can access that much supply to meet their demands. It's often the case that you know, the objectives are grand, but the practicity of meeting these objectives faces a series of challenges that often also results to product substitution, which is something that we were talking before. Substituting timber for non-timber products, substituting tropical timber for temperate timber, substituting natural forests managed wood for plantation timber. This is very bad for the sector. And apart from that, suppliers also have their own list of complaints. I mean, suppliers, it's often the case that you see them saying, well, we work really hard to meet these standards. We work really hard to meet the Flag T license stage in the case of Indonesia. And we are finding it difficult to connect, to find the demand that wants the attributes that we're producing. So there is clearly, or, you know, the price premium, you know, it's one that was always talked. We work to get certified, we don't find the buyers, we don't find the price premium that we expected. So there is a clear disconnect. There is a market failure, a disconnect between suppliers of sustainable and legal products and the demand for these products. Which is, you know, it's detrimental to the sector and to the growth of the sector, the growth of sustainability and certification. Next one. So recognizing this market failure, BV Rio, which stands for the Rio de Janeiro Environmental Exchange, created a responsible timber exchange which has exactly the objective of connecting the legal sellers to responsible buyers, connecting sustainable sellers to responsible buyers. The exchange uses both online and offline activities to do this task. I mean, we use a couple of very powerful online tools. The first one was the exchange itself, which is a trading platform that buyers and sellers can post the requests for quotations or their sales offer into the exchange. Once it's put there, it's available for thousands of users. We then kind of divulge it using e-commerce and digital tools. We send to more than 100,000 people all over the world, and they meet there and start negotiating. It's in effect a very powerful procurement tool for those that want to aggregate volume of wood with certain characteristics, be it sustainability, be it legality, apart from the product characteristics. The other tool that is available, which is connected to the trading platform, is the due diligence tool. So essentially, in order to comply with EU regulation, with American regulation, you do need to conduct a due diligence to ensure that what you bring into your countries come from at least legal sources. So we offer that as well online as a means to facilitate the due diligence that is necessary. We focus on individual timber consignments as opposed to screening suppliers. That's what the third, that very complicated graph is all about, is kind of illustrating how supply chains of wood products work, in that case, in the Amazon. So we launched both these products about 10 months ago, and we were very happy with the uptake. I mean, actually surprised that 10 months after we launched the trading platform, we have about 18 million cubic meters of timber products passing through the exchange. To put it into perspective, this is about 5% of the global tropical forest timber production worldwide. And we were also very happy that about 15% of these products, either demanded or offered, were certified, mostly by the FSC. So given that, announcements are very much in fashion now, we would like to make our own. So our 2020 target, because everybody has one, is to increase this volume to about 50 million cubic meters of legal timber transacted in the Responsible Timber Exchange, and at least 50% of them certified for sustainability. This is our goal. This is our contribution to this sector. This is the contribution to this discussion, and I hope that a lot of you can help us with that. We can collaborate with you, that you can contribute to us contributing to these targets. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Pedro. That's a great story. Could you just clarify something, and then I'll attach a question to this too. You described insufficient demand for sustainable timber, and then you describe it, I think, as a market failure. So is it that there is insufficient demand, or that the market is not connecting suppliers and users? And I'll attach this question to it. The demand that you're seeing through the exchange, what's driving that? And is the exchange itself driving demand?
Both. No, I do. I mean, my first slide about announcements illustrates that there should be demand. I mean, there's a lot of companies, of governments, of procurement programs worldwide that would like, preferentially, to use legal as opposed to illegal. I mean, there's no doubt about it, to use sustainable as opposed to not sustainable. The market failure is the difficulty sometimes to connect to suppliers with those attributes, sustainability or legality. I recently had refurbishment in my own house that was before the trading platform, and I couldn't find a sufficient source of FSC-certified tropical timber. And that's ridiculous. I mean, I am in this sector. We should be able to source these things more easily. With relation to your question, there is demand, but our role is to increase demand, to raise awareness that there is volume, there is volume of legal, sustainable, certified timber with the right quality as well, which is often complained. Oh, all this certified stuff, great, but is the quality good? And it is, and we should link demand with supply, and by doing that, assist in growing this market segment and make it more mainstream as opposed to niche.
Okay, thank you very much for that. John Huntely.
Thank you for the invitation, and I do not think that I have to explain what FSC is about. And on the slide you see the most important result of FSC's work after 20 years. Almost 200 million hectares in the world is FSC certified in 84 countries. Some 140,000 foresters are involved. You see two weak spots. One is Greenland, but that is probably acceptable. And then the other one is Africa, where indeed, and in general, tropical forest is still a much too small part of that certification globally. Next slide. We do have figures on how much these areas actually contribute to global production, but this is production only in relation to industrial wood, which is based on FAO figures. You see that almost 16% of the global industrial wood production comes from FSC certified forest. It's slightly higher percentage for plantations, and slightly, but only slightly less for tropical timber. That by itself, of course, is a surprise, but it's of course not a real surprise because, as I mentioned, it is comparing the total production of industrial wood, and in the tropics, most of the wood still goes for wood fuel, which is outside of that calculation. But also, it does mean, of course, that tropical forests apparently contribute much less to the global wood use in the world than they could be or should be. And that is a key issue, I think, for us, not only to see how we can sell more sustainable wood, but also how we can sell more sustainable tropical wood to make sure that it's also beneficial in the tropics to conserve and to do sustainable forest management. Next slide. An important driver of FSC success has been the demand side always. Demand from companies, by general public, by procurers, which is to a large extent been driven by NGO campaigning. But we do not have a real good picture of the update on the market. We can only give some figures about trends. There are some 60,000 companies working together in 33,000 chain of custody certificates. So also our whole chain of custody is controlled by auditors, and they control companies that have agreed to work with FSC Timber and to be agreed to be controlled, that their output with the claim of FSC is a real claim. These companies work in 120 countries. What is really interesting, I think, for the future is that the country with by far the biggest amount of chain of custody certificates, and is China, and if you include Hong Kong, 18% of the FSC chain of custody certificates globally are in China and in Hong Kong. And 30% of the chain of custody certificates are in Asia altogether. But we do not know exactly how much of these companies actually produce FSC certified timber. They are not obliged to go for 100% FSC. We have made a calculation, and based on surveys, which says that almost 28% of the production of those companies is FSC certified. So it's not nothing, it's quite substantial. But of course for us, the second key issue, apart from the challenge of tropical timbers, is to make sure that these companies are increasingly going to use certified materials. And there we see, and it's interesting after the presentation from Pedro, that there is still a big mismatch. We hear foresters complaining that there's no market for the FSC certified materials, and we hear processing industry complaining that they can't find FSC timber. This is really a big challenge and a big task for us. Last slide. We are convinced and optimistic that our role will grow. We're not a technical tool that's produced by some experts. Of course, we do appreciate experts and scientists, but we are really a movement. And earlier this month we had our General Assembly. There were 900 members represented there. This is the picture at the end of the conference. At least 2 other panelists you can find on this picture. Of course, if you have very sharp eyes. And this meeting was really reconfirming and strengthening our system with regards to social issues, to protection of intact forest landscapes, and also to smallholder certification. And we have set an aim to to cover 20% of the global timber trade by 2020, which means that we need still to work on increased forest cover and particularly also labeling of end products to make it more visible. As regards to the discussions that we had already this morning, you see on the one hand concerns about that wood is not popular enough. On the other hand, you see concerns about dramatically increased demand. And I think when we talk about dramatically increased demand, we indeed need to focus on those products that have mutual benefits for society. In the first place, construction has been mentioned already a bit. I think we should talk more about it. And secondly, bio-based materials. And I'm not speaking about bioenergy. I think it's for us problematic to actively promote more use of bioenergy. As in our membership, the opinions are very much divided. And also, when we talk about FAO and the public organizations, we should probably also talk very much more about the role of public procurement in steering the demand. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, John. 2 quick questions. Well, the first is not perhaps straightforward, and that's if we're talking about timber that is not certified, should we take it to mean that that is unsustainable, or if that's not straightforwardly the case, what are the other signals or tools that consumers, markets can use to try to work out what's sustainable and what's not? And a follow-up is, can you just give us a quick comment on Africa? You know, the next huge repository of tropical forests, the next frontier for tropical forest loss, and it's not on your map effectively. But the first question first, if I may.
Yeah. No, timber that is not FSC certified is not by definition coming from unsustainably managed forest. Obviously, we cannot make that claim. The only claim we can make that if you buy certified products, that you at least know that has been checked, that it comes from sustainably managed forest. We even have a system ourselves, which is called controlled wood, which is a system that looks at countries as a whole, whether the material that's coming from those countries are, by and large, applying to maybe 5 basic components which not together define sustainable forest management, but can avoid the worst impacts. Of course, I think the advantage of certification is that people who are not all experts on forestry and who don't know where the wood comes from in most cases don't have to do all this research themselves. But indeed, there is, of course, a lot of sustainable material on the market that's not certified. We don't deny that. On Africa, well, Africa is a big challenge for us. We are quite present in 3 countries in the Congo Basin: Congo, Cameroon, and Gabon. This is partly because these countries work with large concessions. They are European companies. They have a clear demand from their consumers in Europe. So their certification is working. But in countries like Democratic Republic of Congo or other countries where the demand is almost entirely domestic, where the market is not heavily regulated, it's apparently for foresters who are interested in better management. They can, of course, follow our requirements, but apparently it's not interesting to comply with us. And I think this is why fighting illegal timber is so important, because in those countries there is so much illegal timber and informal timber around, that for a forester to want to follow all the rules of FSC, he's creating an enormous difference with his colleagues, and not only in terms of environmental performance, but definitely also in social performance. The obligations of certification towards the local population, they are quite different from the lack of obligations that other foresters may feel. So yes, it is a big challenge, and I think we can only move forward if in the consumer countries in particular, tropical timber gets much more acceptable again. And of course, certified timber, tropical timber has a lot of advantages that are probably underestimated.
Thanks, John. Carrie.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. I was a bit afraid that the very accurate questions from James and the quality of my predecessor intervening would take all the wind from my small statement, but I've got a bit of something, a little bit of a different message, or at least a complementary one, I hope. So I would like to link my opening statement to the Sustainable Development Goals. As you all know, they are a universal call to action, and they are, in our opinion, an inclusive agenda, and they work mainly in the spirit of a partnership. So when we consider the SDGs from a forest certification perspective, one of the biggest challenges is to ensure that this well-intentioned sustainable purchasing policies in the forest sectors do not end up having adverse impacts on the very people that need development progress in the forest. Research and at least some of the remarks we've already heard suggest that there is still much progress to be made to ensure that certification adds value to households' livelihoods and increases productivity for the smallholders producing wood. Sustainable forest management and forest certification can not only be a tool for corporate communication. SFM is about protecting biodiversity, combating climate change, and sustainable livelihood. Our common goal should be to expand SFM, and here I can also add to what was said before in the way that for us it is obvious that sustainability exists outside the scope of certification, of course, and to increase the availability of sustainable wood product and to expand SFM. We should, I think, in a way, try to open all avenues to sustainability insurance and not try to make of a certification and sustainability insurance a restricted club. And I would like to give, for example, two examples. We had a lot of figures, and I hope nobody will ask the source from the one I will quote, but something I have said I could use. For example, I think that 10% of the industrial warrant wood in the world comes from non-forest. And in PFC, at the moment, we are working on development on trees outside a forest standard. And that's together with a movement that we observe at the moment in the EU context, in which we as PFC do not play a role, but it's a trend that we observe. We have said that in the biomass discussion at EU policy level, there is now the possibility that we will have very soon in the future a system that bases sustainability insurance on risk assessment at sourcing area or supplies bay level. So that indicates that there is a trend in the market that is trying to push for creating more avenues to sustainability and not restrict them. And if you put that together with the notion that when we discuss this prevalence of certification, despite all the maps that we could show, we know that a very, very, very large extent of the forest certification is in the northern hemisphere, where we could argue that we needed the less, and in the southern hemisphere we have way less of it. So that's what we should think and discuss about together.
Thanks very much indeed, Harry. Let me just ask you a variant of the same question that I put to Hej earlier. I think, it's remarkable considering that whatever it is, 500 million hectares of forest or more is under certification, that there are still open questions about how effective it is, where it works, and to whose benefit. It does seem that certification goes along with sustainable forest use, a beneficial environmental impact on the forest. But there's a much less convincing case that forest communities are benefiting from the production, even when they're the producers. Can you just speak to that? And is there anything that the certifiers can do to ensure that those benefits flow to producing communities?
As I've said in my statement, I think that the problem is more that I think there is it's hardly deniable that the access to the main markets has become linked to sustainability insurance, certification, other forms of sustainability or legality insurance. So I'm not completely convinced that there is not this value. I think there is this value for certification and sustainability insurance. I think my problem is more how a broader community of people, and especially the small forest holders, can have access to this. I know that it means, and it's true, that the fact that I say that there is sustainability outside certification, I don't say that the picture is the same everywhere. We know there are troubles in governance, that deforestation has been a fact, etc. But there are probably, we should think also in terms of accessibility of this sustainability insurance and the way we design it to broader group of people, because it has become, and more increasingly, a way of accessing market that has become more and more important than this adequacy that we were saying before. So that's maybe later in the value chain and harder for me to say that the available of certified wood, if it finds its place in the market. But I know there is also a lot of places where there is no sustainability insurance, and communities and smallholders in need of accessing the market, so of being able to demonstrate the sustainability of their practices. I don't know if it answers your question.
No, I don't think it really does. I think you sort of described the problem, really, again. I mean, so we know that where certification becomes the rules of the game, where it's the price or the burden of market access, there it has its own momentum and it's beneficial. But where it's not the rules of the game, like in DRC, Central Africa, is there more that can be done to make it beneficial, especially to smallholders?
But I don't think in Africa we don't have enough certification because certification is not beneficial to them. It's just because certification is not accessible for them, either of affordability, of management practices, of inadequacy of what we request with the situation. So,
but that's a challenge to you as well as them.
Yes, of course, we are part of the challenge, but I think if people could easily become certified, they would do it. So because the value is there, and the market access would be improved. So why do we not? Don't we have enough, especially in Africa, of certified areas or FLEGT also? Whatever can improve the market access and certify either legality or sustainability or both. It's a problem in which we are a part with our standards, our conformity assessment process. Is it too demanding, too costly? But it is also because I think in general people tend to find it difficult, and the companies operating in the region tend to find it difficult to be able to comply with those requirements and explore other avenues, their own schemes, their own legality insurance system. I think it's in the case of Africa, I think it's not because people.
I mean, is it because you need a basic minimum of governance that is not available in?
Yeah, but I don't say only in the country, also in practices of the company. Obviously, the way forestry works in certain regions in Africa, it's hard for companies even who try to obviously make it compliant with the requirements of that we set, or that timber procurement sets. So it seems that there is this problem.
Thank you very much indeed. Marcus Alves.
Thank you, James, and thank FAO for having me here. For me, it's a pleasure. Good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning. I'm gonna here present to you some of the thoughts and views that the Brazilian Forest Service has regarding sustainable production of wood, with a special regard to the Amazon tropical forest. Well, it's not difficult, I think, for most of us to either think or talk about sustainable production of wood. In general, people feel very comfortable in positioning themselves on wood production. This is something that we see every other time. And therefore, they are always willing to suggest, or in many cases, decisively contribute for the establishment of rules and patterns to guarantee that wood is produced sustainably. And this is actually very good. But in contrast, people are not interested that much in contributing to consume not only wood, but even worse, other materials, non-renewable materials, sustainably produced. And this makes the equation a little bit unbalanced. Not only because there is not much pressure for the sustainable production of metal, plastic, ceramics, glass, masonry, and others that direct compete with wood, and of course with our forests. But also because most of those who demand sustainable produced wood are not willing to pay a fair price for it. And this is, I think, is key in this discussion. In fact, people are not willing, when I say people, I say in a broad sense, especially corporations, are not willing to pay more even for timber that has been cleared by trustful and respectful chain of custody systems. And this has a huge impact on governmental policies and strategies that deal with a long-term dilemma, that is how to keep forests standing and promote economic growth. The Brazilian Forest Service is convinced that sustainable forest management is in large scale is the path for the sustainable production of tropical timber, tropical wood, and more. In our case, for the sustainable development of the Amazon region. We are sure that adding value to the forest is the easiest and cheapest way, not just to curb deforestation and forest degradation, but also to create jobs and provide a better income for the people that live in forested areas. It's just not acceptable that highly covered forest areas concentrate very low human development indexes, shortage of jobs, extreme poverty, and so on. This is why we at the Brazilian Forest Service are implementing a very consistent model for forest concessions, fully transparent, and with a very strong governance system as an umbrella. This allows a complete traceability of wood production, socially and environmentally responsible forest operations, and benefit sharing among all those involved. Command and control measures are necessary, of course, but not enough to change the production patterns and to improve the standard of living of forest-dependent people. Sustainable forest management is key for that change. However, this will only happen if sustainable consumption of wood ceases to be rhetoric and becomes a reality. Thank you very much.
Okay, so just one small thing. You talked about a fair price, that consumers are not willing to pay a fair price for sustainable wood. So if the market is not in and of itself determining what's fair, how does one go about that? Do you have a suggestion?
Well, to be very straight in my answer, I would say today the fair price is to pay much more that people are currently paying for sustainable, especially tropical timber or wood. So I think that the value is there, but people are not willing to pay. So, and this is why the competition is so unbalanced, because every time that you offer, that you provide sustainable wood, you don't find a fair price. And the fair price, as I said, needs to be much more than the one that is on the market.
Pedro, do you want to just comment on that? Do you see price differentiation in your market based on just how sustainable? I mean, does certified wood and uber sustainable wood command a different price? Do you have buyers who are willing to pay more for more assurance?
No, not really. And that has always been a complaint of those that achieve certification, that they are always aiming at a price differential, and it hasn't happened. And the answer was always, well, but what you can obtain is a market segment that a guarantee of demand. So it's much more about having a space in the market than getting a market premium, unfortunately. And even that, as John mentioned, I mean, sometimes there is this disconnect that theoretically that should be the demand, but the supplier not necessarily managed to reach it. But his point, I mean, Marcus' point is an important one. I mean, we shouldn't treat natural forest management, tropical timber, as a staple, but it should really be a luxury item. It's trees that took centuries to grow, that they are a superior product to what kind of plantation timber is. And it's something that a marketing effort that tropical countries should try to figure out how to obtain, how to market it better than they have done in the past.
It's a hard sell, isn't it? To tell industry they should be using more of this stuff and they should be paying more for it. Mikhail, can you represent perhaps yourself, but anyway, IKEA in this conversation? Thank you.
Right, yeah. Thank you very much for inviting us. I'll try to give a perspective of the private sector in this debate, which is very important for us. Well, it all starts from the vision, and our vision in IKEA is to make everyday life of the many people better. And it's about 800 million visitors who visit IKEA stores, shop in IKEA every year. But it's also about many, many communities and small forest holders who are directly or indirectly connected to IKEA value chains. Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations are guiding our sustainability work and our people and planet positive sustainability strategy. And we are committed not only to transform our business and our value chain, but also we are aiming at transforming the consumer behavior by offering the products that are helping to save water, energy, other resources, and also products that have circular capabilities inbuilt. An example could be our commitment and a goal to replace all fossil-based plastics with recycled or biogenic plastics, or use new wood-based products and new designs in our products to deliver the same quality to our customers and at the same time use much, much less resources. IKEA is using about 1% of world commercial harvest. and it's about 18 million cubic meters of wood every year. But as we say, with the size comes the responsibility, and this is in line with our People and Planet Positive sustainability strategy. We are committed to become forest positive. And what does it mean? So first of all, we are committed that by 2020, we want to use all the wood in our products and packaging materials coming from what we call most sustainable sources, which is today defined as FSC certified or recycled wood. And we are already on a very good track to reach this goal. We are using today 77% of our wood comes from either FSC certified or recycled sources, 77%. Second, it's also about promoting sustainable forest management at the scale much exceeding the need in our products. And this is what we are doing, especially in the challenging regions where we are sourcing wood from. So in our partnership with such partners like WWF, we already contributed to certification of 35 million hectares, which is roughly the size of Germany. And we are really committed to make the sustainable forest management an industry norm. Finally, we believe that by promoting sustainable forest management, we contribute to ending forest degradation and deforestation. Well, being bold in the commitments does not only mean to set very ambitious goals, but it also means to speak openly about the challenges that we have in front of us. And at IKEA, we often say that the challenges are opportunities, and we try to really turn them into the opportunities. And one of them is a better integration of the small forest holders to the global supply chains and to the markets. We've done tremendous, really big step in securing that all our wood that is originating from the countries where sustainable forestry is a question mark, or forestry risk countries, all that wood is coming from FSC certified sources today already. This is a big step forward, but we still see that there is a strong need to secure that the small forest holders and communities have an access to the global markets via affordable certification systems, so that they would not have barriers to enter the certification system as a barrier to access the global markets. And there is a great deal of need to strengthen and empower small forest holders so that their voice would be really heard in the global forest debate, and also to strengthen them through the financial mechanism. And we are considering today a small forest holder finance mechanism that would provide incentives for them to really exercise the sustainable forestry practices. And this is only possible in the partnership between the key stakeholders, between the private forest sector, between the governments, between non-governmental organizations, donors, and other key stakeholders. So we believe that by being bold in the commitments, going all for it in sustainability goals, but also by engaging in dialogue and partnership with key stakeholders, we can secure that sustainable forest management can address the key sustainability challenges like forest degradation, deforestation, and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve Michael. That's a staggering number, 1% of global supply. Is that all timber, all commercial timber? What does that represent exactly, that 1%?
Yeah, so that is 18 million cubic meters that we are using in IKEA that goes into our products, into our packaging, into our catalog, for example, and paper-based products. So that's our estimate, and it's about 1% of all commercially harvested wood.
And what proportion of that is tropical hardwood? A very low proportion.
Our main species are pine, birch, and beech, which are typical Nordic and boreal species. From the tropical zone, we are using primarily acacia from Southeast Asia, bamboo, but they don't represent a very big share today.
Sure.
But that is growing.
So that may qualify this, my more serious question, which is, with that large market share, I mean, in relative terms, what do you see about your own power to influence markets? Do you see suppliers wanting to get certified or to pass other assurance tests so that they become eligible for IKEA? Do you see that you're changing behavior in this or any other way?
Absolutely. As I said it, I think that we had really a fantastic journey that we are happy to share when we secure today that all our wood coming from the challenging countries or the countries that have high risk of forest degradation and deforestation is already FSC certified. So we already achieved it.
But,
and it's about
you're
a
seeing,
quota of our wood.
do you actually see that you're driving the spread of certification in those forest risk countries?
Yeah, we are driving this through a very bold, clear demands when we integrate our sustainability demands into our procurement policies and via partnership with many organizations like WWF, like state forest administrations in some countries, many other partners.
What frustrations do you have with the assurance and certification process? Are there things that you would like to be included and that are not included, things that you find onerous that you would take out if you could?
Well, it's not a frustration, but as I mentioned, we believe that there is enormous opportunity to continue this journey, to really make sure that the environmental impact and effect that we already reached will stay for the time, even though IKEA may move its supply chain from a particular community. And this is only possible, we believe, via creating incentives and motivation for the forest producers to improve their forestry practices, maybe to add value to the products that they produce today in the
But
value
what about
chain.
the assurance process or certification being one of them? Do you have any criticisms or comments on the nature of the standards, the nature of certification?
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk about FSC that we are working very closely with, and we've been challenging and criticizing FSC for quite some time based on our own experience in our supply chain, that FSC should transform its standards to meet the context of the small forest holders. And I'm very happy to see FSC is really taking big steps, what is called new approaches to small forest holders that meet in the reality of this particular
So
customer.
it should be easier for smallholders.
Absolutely. So we would like to FSC and other certification system to remove all the financial barriers or to minimize them as much as possible, so the small forest holders would have an access to the global supply chain. And IKEA recently joined the so-called Vancouver Declaration, which is a very bold statement of the leading businesses recognizing FSC as one of the tool and verifier of sustainable forest management. So we are happy to lead this way.
John, do you just want to pick up on that? Have IKEA forced you to rethink your position on smallholders?
Well, IKEA is one of our most important members and users of the system, and I mean, you can hardly underestimate the role of IKEA. Mikael has mentioned a general figure of 35 million hectares that are certified, with IKEA being the main incentive. A country like Romania is now a country where certification has grown very fast, and I understand that's mainly because of the cooperation between IKEA and WWF. So IKEA is a very important player. It's also supportive in the sense that it has is one of the key players in a project called VIA, which is trying to make the benefits, the value of certification more clear, because you mentioned there is always lack of the final proof that certification works. Partly that is logical because forests grow slowly and change slowly, and you need 30, 40 years to make a decision on whether the process has been indeed delivered a real sustainable ecosystem. So IKEA is a very important player, and well, we all share the same concern about smallholders. I also don't think it is that black and white. There is a lot of group certification already going on in FSC, and it's not always so that the price premium is a barrier. I can give an example. Navigator used to be called Portocel, a Portuguese paper company, has really invested in Portugal. The smallholders are really small holders. They have maybe 3 or 4 hectares, and they have absolutely no capacity to do it by themselves. But there was a really urgent need for certified materials, so Portocel themselves organized the foresters, provided them with training and the organization, and even guarantees them a price premium of €4 per cubic meter. And then it works. Indeed, certification is a market-driven instrument. So the market players have to play an important role. Another point I wanted to make about local communities, it's not only that local communities benefit from certification when they are themselves the forest managers. They also benefit when they live in concessions that are managed by somebody else, but where they live. And the very clear examples are in Central Africa, where the concession holders, and C4 and WWF has done research on that, how much local communities benefit when they live in or from those concessions in terms of improved access to health, education, safer jobs, better training, more jobs. And also in a country like Canada, where the First Nations benefit from certification in guaranteeing their traditional rights. Even discussion at the FSC earlier this month, when we talked about intact forest landscapes, the First Nations and indigenous people have always emphasized there's also something like intact cultural landscapes, because the forest, we may think they are entirely virgin, but there are always been people living in there, and it's their natural environment. So local communities can also benefit, even if they're not forest managers themselves.
Thanks very much for that, John. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've got time for, I think, just a couple of questions, if there are some, before we go to lunch. Okay, we've got more than a couple, but let's try and 2 at a time, please. We'll take 2 questions at a time, and we'll try and get through those 6 or 8 hands that went up. Gary, you've had your turn. No, we won't start with you, Gary, because you've spoken. Gentleman behind you. Not that we don't want to hear everything you have to say.
Scott Francisco from Wood at Work. So a question for IKEA under the heading of "With great power comes great responsibility," and speaking to the question of the value of sustainably sourced woods, or the undervaluing currently of sustainably sourced woods. Is IKEA ready to start working with your customers to educate them and essentially elevate the price of the products, to elevate the value of this wood and push that down the supply chain back to the, in particular, small forest holders? Are you in a position to do that? And is there market strategies that IKEA could use with your enormous market share?
Thank you. This is a very good question. Our vision is that we have to be able to provide our customers with the materials that are functional, with the good form, with the price as low so that as many as possible people can afford to buy it, with the quality and with sustainability. That's what we call the democratic diamond, democratic design principle in IKEA. So it's not only one of them, but it's all of them have to be in place. And our vision that our customers should be able to buy sustainably produced products at the same price as the products that are today not fully sustainable or meeting our more sustainable definition today. So this is our vision. And of course, the way that we are doing this is really different cases. It's mainly the distribution of the cost of certification through the whole value chain, through the whole supply chain. There are some areas where we have to invest and we have to add the price to really cover the cost of certification. But I want to also mention that the cost of certification itself is normally quite marginal if you really take it if you break down it to the whole cost of the product. It's normally, in most of the cases, quite a marginal. So this is not something that is not possible, I would say.
certification and the cost of certification isn't the only issue here, that there's a chronic undervaluing of that material coming out of these forests. And if IKEA and other private sector is only willing to pay for the cost of certification, we are going to lose this battle. That somehow we have to find ways to value this wood appropriately, and maybe the market isn't the only way to do that, but it's certainly a very significant part of that.
Okay, Gary is urgently demanding the microphone.
Because for me, the big issue is the big elephant in the room is that we cannot continue talking about value chains in general. We all agree that certification is good. Most of us here work on creating FSC. The issue is not the certification, is what do we mean by value chain? So I challenge some of the assessments, even made by Marcus. If we're talking about, let's take mahogany as an example so that you understand what I mean. 2 millimeter veneer of mahogany for 1 square meter will cost $6. $6. How much is a table that has that veneer in it? 100? So would that be a problem, increasing the price of the veneer by 50%? And instead of paying $6 per veneer, you pay $9 per veneer. You're still going to sell the timber, the table for $100 or $102. Who pays 100? Pays 103. So you can even pass the price directly to the consumer. So that's one type of value product. But let's take another one. There was a company in Brazil which was one of the first FSC certified in the Amazon. It bankrupt. Why? It was well managed? No. It was a problem of management? No. It was well managed. However, they were providing plywood. And they were plywood that was used as flooring of buses in Brazil. Now, do you get in a bus and think, I'm getting in a bus only if the timber is certified? No, nobody gets into the bus because of that. Therefore, you cannot increase the value of that product because it's certified. Nobody's going to, the bus company is not, the issue is not IKEA, the issue is the bus company that is buying this flooring and doing that. There are hundreds and thousands of products which are not directly end-use consumer. So we as consumers can demand this from IKEA, but we don't demand from the other sources. So there are different value chains. So for certain value chains, I do believe certification makes a difference. For the other ones, they are flying stealth because we only talk about sustainability. We are not talking about the different value chains. You understand, Marcus? So I think there is a price out there, but the price out there is for the end product, not for the products which are when timber is part of something else. There is nothing wrong with IKEA using pine because it doesn't make sense to make fiber out of mahogany. It makes sense to make fiber out of pine and put a veneer of mahogany on it. That's the way it should be done. You can even drive nail in some of these hardwoods. That's what they call hardwoods. You cannot make a board out of it and drive nails, so they're not used for that. So until we start talking about the different types of value chain and understanding how certification will work and sustainable use will work for different types of product, not only forests in general, we're always going to have this conversation saying the price is not good or the price is... It depends. I think we have to start drilling down and dividing boxes.
The conversation on this panel, familiar as it is about the inability of certification to increase price.
But there has increased price.
So do you have a recommendation?
Yeah. The recommendation
if certification can't do it, then how do you change certification, or what alternative means do you have?
Because certification is doing it. I challenge the idea that certification is not doing it, but certification is doing for the end products. I don't receive a business card that is not FSC certified for, even in China, where I worked for years. They're still already FSC certified because it's an end product. But I think that we cannot assume that for certification is going to be the aspirin that is going to cure all the problems we have in forests for the value chains which are not end products to the consumers, which are a small part. Take a sofa that IKEA makes. You know, there is wood inside the sofa. Nobody goes and buys a sofa based on the wood that is in there. And it's going to be hard to change the people's mind that I have to look into this when you buy a house. Do you buy a house, you go there and says, was this FSC certified? If it's not, I'm not buying the apartment. It is not, well, maybe new one, yes, but old ones, no. So it's not feasible to think that we are going to solve all the problems with certification, but we should not ask FSC or certification to solve all the problems. That's what I'm saying. We should divide the value chain in different topics. The end users, we should use FSC, but we have to find other solutions, other ways of dealing for the value chains, which are not end products for us. Otherwise, we're always going to have this discussion and start looking like beating poor FSC that certification is not helping. It is, but it's only
I
helping for
don't
something.
think we've just been beating up on FSC and certification. Anyway, we'll
but
move
in
on because I
general,
think
that's
we'll
what
come
becomes
back
a-
to that, and we have a number of hands in the air, and we're already past our cut-off time. So, gentleman there, and just lady there, and lady there. Okay, and we'll have these 4 questions, and then we'll wrap up. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Duncan McQueen from IIED. I was at a meeting recently where the head of the Canadian Forest Service was noting that 55% of the commercial production of one of the species, I think it was a pine in their forest, was succumbing to a pest and disease outbreak because of climate change and stress to the trees, and that was largely a function of the relative uniformity of the Canadian forests. So the Brazilian colleagues from Bama were saying that isn't really a problem in Brazil. And so my question really is about the security of the future supply of wood. And of course, hearing the grand scale at which IKEA is operating and the rather limited numbers of species that are involved there, and the efforts to involve smallholders that they're undertaking in Southeast Asia, for example. I guess my question is that, of course, it's possible to organize smallholders to achieve scale efficiencies and so supply markets such as those of IKEA. But the tendency is towards multiple smallholdings producing one thing, Acacia mangium in that case. And I guess that raises in my head a concern that maybe...
Can I just ask you to bring it to the point, because we need to move on?
Is maybe the scale at which these things are happening, the market nature, the market mechanism which favors scale, that is causing problems for us. And wouldn't we be better legislating towards a more integrated, diverse production system rather than relying on the market to achieve that for us?
So should we be regulating more and relying on the market less? And who do you want that question to go to? To Mikhail. Okay. Do you want more regulation?
Yeah, I think this is quite a complex question, and definitely if the legislation, which very good and very strong in many countries, but the law enforcement is not, as we know, if they would really play the key role in securing sustainable forest management and also empowering the small forest holders of communities and taking care of the indigenous people in their indigenous cultural landscapes, that would probably basically eliminate the need for any voluntary market certification. But we all know that this is not the case today, and this is where I see that there is still, I wouldn't underestimate the role that the private sector and the question that there was a previous question that whether we can educate our customers even better. Yes, definitely we can, and this is our responsibility to do these things. As I already mentioned, we have a very ambitious goal in our sustainability strategy to change the consumer behavior, and this is one of the part of this. So I think that this is still a key driver to really scale up the effort that we demonstrated today as possible.
Okay, thank you. Lady there, could I ask you please, the 3 of you who I said that I would come to, just keep the questions quite short and pointed, if you can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Nadej Zoyem from Rainforest Alliance, Yaoundé, Cameroon. We noticed in Central Africa that the surface area for FSC certification is stable since several years, especially since the FLEX VPA process. Do you perceive the FLEX that is based only on legal requirement as a threat or obstacle to the growth of FSC or PFC certification? And my second question is that in Cameroon, for example, we have more than 1 million hectares managed by forest communities. And we noticed that there are programs supporting big industries. Those are those already having financial capacities to meet forest certification requirements. So what, apart from the standards, what are the concrete measures to maintain smallholders in sustainable wood value chains?
Okay, I'm going to suggest that we only take the first of those questions. We've been discussing the second, and we really are running out of time. Javier, do you want to comment on that? Is FLEGT eating into your ability to expand in Africa, for example?
Well, I know the question was also for John, but thanks. In our case, as you probably are aware, we don't currently issue licenses for forest certification in Africa. This situation will change very soon, in a few months, hopefully. When we were talking about that before, in our case, it's more a problem that we had a certain number of issues finding the right, not the governance structure, but we function with a specific system of accreditation and certification. So the standard is out there for a few years already, in the case of Gabon, for example, but what was missing is our ability to perform or to deliver the conformity assessment that we need to be able to start the work. And we also now have lined up a few companies. In the specific relation to the FLEGT VPA and the EU timber regulation, I wouldn't say that in our case it has a very strong link in either sense. It is certainly not an obstacle, certainly not. You can't really say that it's become a driver as such, because in the current context of the VPA action plan or the FLEGT action plan, the role for what is called private certification is still a bit unclear, and it is obvious that in the market the company tend to use certifications for ensuring or for showing that they comply with the due diligence, but it is not an evidence that will be everywhere accepted the same way, and so there is a kind of confusion around the role that we can play both in UTR simply compliance. So it is not the driver. I wouldn't see that it is a problem and that it is led. Maybe you could argue, and in some cases that I don't have any concrete examples, that there might be a bit of disillusion in some cases where companies had anticipated that they would be able to use a tool such as certification, and that would be naturally accepted as complying with a UTR obligation, and they have quickly discovered that it was not the case, and that there are still issues around that. So that's maybe the only comment that I could do, but I don't see a link. For me, the problems around certification in Africa are more linked in Cameroon or in other countries, more to the fact that it seems to be very difficult today for companies exploiting timber in Africa to satisfy with the standards, and and that there have been problems.
Thank you, Javier. John, are you feeling the effects of FLEGT in Africa?
Well, we see by definition any attempt to promote legality not as a threat, but as necessary. It's a necessary component, building block for sustainable forest management. So we very much support FLEGT, and in addition to that, the way FLEGT is being tried in Africa and Asia and so on is in a very inclusive way with stakeholder engagement, so that's very positive. The problem is, of course, that it's not delivering. It's not delivering FLEGT license in Africa, and there we are a bit in a gray zone. But what I also appreciate of Cameroon, Republic of Congo, is that they also realize that certification can be a tool integrated in the FLEGT process. And the only problem in Cameroon is that they have chosen a very complicated way in putting that into practice, but you know that probably better than anyone else in the room here.
Okay, thank you. Lady here and a gentleman behind you. Please, short questions if you can.
Rosondo, PAFC Gabon, Programme panafricain de certification forestière Gabon. Je n'ai pas vraiment une question. Ce que je voudrais apporter
If you don't have a question, then is it possible to save it till later? Because we've gone beyond our time. If you have a short, pointed question that you would like to ask to any of our panelists, please put it to them. Otherwise, you'll have plenty of opportunity to speak in the next 2 days.
Non, je voulais dire simplement que les autres pratiques qui permettent de gérer durablement nos forêts aujourd'hui, dans notre pays et en Afrique en général, c'est l'aménagement durable des forêts, qui prend en compte les aspects de sylviculture, la protection de l'environnement et qui prend en compte également les bénéfices sociaux. D'ailleurs, la certification forestière ne peut se faire que sur une forêt aménagée. Parce que la question a été posée tout à l'heure, mais on n'a pas retenu de réponse. Donc la certification n'est pas la seule pratique en Afrique. D'ailleurs, l'aménagement est obligatoire. Donc elle touche tous les acteurs qui sont dans le secteur. Et la certification aujourd'hui reste volontaire. Donc ne touche que quelques acteurs de la filière. Je voulais poser une question provocante, mais bon, comme je n'ai pas assez de temps, à IKEA, je ne la pose pas.
That's probably going to be a change because my French declined to the level that I was not able to follow and I didn't get a translation. If somebody would help to...
La question à IKEA que je voulais poser est celle de savoir, tout à l'heure, IKEA a dit qu'elle ne prenait en compte que la certification FSC. Il comprend pas.
I'm afraid we don't have translation and we've gone over our time.
I don't think so.
Stay in the
Speak
discussion.
English.
Stay in the discussion and you'll have plenty of opportunity to speak. You will, I assure you. Now we have to wrap up. We've had an excellent start to this event. Thank you all very much for your questions, for your patience, for your interest. Just a couple of quick announcements. We will have a 2-hour, now a little bit less than 2 hour, lunch break, during which sandwiches will be served where you found coffee served before we started this morning. The live webcast will return in 45 minutes, I take it from now. And between 1:45 and 2:15, there will be a side event on BV Rio. That will be in the Sheikh Zayed Center. That's here. Yeah, that's here. The next session, however, will be in the green room of the first floor building A, which you will find easily. Follow the herd. And finally, just in case any of you will not be with us this afternoon, I can't think why that might be, supper will be at 6 o'clock, between 6 and 8 o'clock on the FAO terrace. Will there be food? It's a reception, there may be food. Don't expect supper. Thank you all.